The author of this fanfiction name is Fanatic06. He works on fanfiction.net and the link is in the description to the stories.
Chapter 48, Forgiveness. Ash continued to stare with his mouth completely open in shock. His father, Red, whom he hasn't seen in over a year, had just dropped in completely unexpected. Where had he come from? Who contacted him? How did he know to come here? Ash's mind was a complete blur as so many questions were swimming through his head. He didn't even know what to say. After recovering from his surprise at the sudden appearance, Giovanni's face took on a menacing tone as he spoke his next words. So you're back. I am, and I will tell you only once to leave my family alone. You're finished, Giovanni, Red uttered, speaking for the first time. Heh heh. I think not. I'm not even going to ask how you managed to avoid the bombs I had set up at my base, but I can still take care of you here. In fact, it's better if I see you die in person, Giovanni smirked as he raised his hand to give the signal. The rocket members raised their guns once more in preparation to shoot Red but found the guns lifted from their hands and dissolved in midair. Everyone gasped at sight as they turned to find the culprit was Yellow. Her eyes were glowing blue as she appeared to be concentrating very hard. It was quite surprising to everyone, even the ones who knew her. They knew Yellow had psychic powers but didn't know they were that powerful. Upon doing the incredible act, Yellow gasped and held her chest while panting while Rose and Grace went to support her. Serena stared in surprise. Would she be able to do something like that one day? Giovanni clenched his hands and his teeth as he turned back to give Red a furious glare, while Red stared back, not angrily, but it still seemed to show authority. So Red thought. He was so big and bad, did he? He hated this man with a passion. He had stolen his son, his ex-lover, and now he thought he could shut down this organization. He needed to be taught a lesson no matter what the cost. His Persian, now recovered from being attacked, joined Giovanni by his side, and it hissed threateningly at Red. Red's Dragonite thundered down onto the platform beside him and glared at the Persian. It doesn't end here. I don't need those to destroy you. Our Pokemon can do that. Giovanni roared. Everyone, release your Pokemon and destroy them once and for all. Pokeballs were soon flying in the air as every rocket member in the room released all of their Pokemon from their Pokeballs. They soon ordered all of their Pokemon to attack anything in their way. This was their last stand. The group wasn't going to take this, however. They soon released all of their Pokemon to fight, as well. Blue, Rose, Yellow, Red, Ash, Brock, Serena, and Misty all fought. Delia was being shielded by Ash during the fight since she had no Pokemon of her own. Ash had to throw her out of the way of several incoming attacks because most of them seemed to be directed at either him or Delia. It was utter chaos in the gym right now due to the number of Pokemon dueling. Several Rocket members were being knocked out due to being hit by their team members' own attacks. The most heated battle, however, was going on between Red's Dragonite and Giovanni's Persian. This is crazy. It's getting hard to tell which Pokemon are friends or foe. Misty cried before she was blasted back by a stray rock slide. She screamed in pain as she slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. Misty! Serena cried as she directed Charla to fire a flamethrower at the Pokemon that hit her, a Dugtrio. Misty's Pokemon joined in the attack, also, even Seduc, though unsuccessfully. Charla obeyed the command and shot a monstrous flamethrower towards the triple mole Pokemon. It was engulfed in the flames before slumping over in defeat. With that taken care of, Serena, Brock, Leaf, and Gary rushed over to Misty, trying to dodge as many attacks as they could. Serena was noticeably slower as she was still exhausted from using her psychic powers earlier. Ash was unable to move due to trying to protect his mom and himself. Misty was groaning in pain as she leaned against the wall. Those rocks really packed a punch and she was covered in bruises and scrapes. Brock kneeled down and took her in his arms to sit her up. "Misty, can you stand?" he asked worriedly. Misty gritted her teeth as she slowly tried to push herself up. "I think I'll be okay. It shouldn't be anything that a few band-aids shouldn't fix," she murmured. The Dragonite and Persian continued to trade blows back and forth. One would think a Dragonite would absolutely crush a Persian due to the difference in power, but Giovanni's Persian was still stronger than one would think. Upon seeing his dad somewhat struggling against Giovanni, Ash ran towards the podium and told his other Pokémon to protect his mom as he ran as he could while trying to dodge all of the attacks flying around. Pikachu was right on his heels. He ran up the steps and reached the platform Red and Giovanni were on and immediately told Pikachu to launch a thunderbolt, which it did. The attack soared through the air and struck Persian as it screeched at the pain. It turned an evil eye over to Pikachu before leaping towards the rodent with outstretched claws, prepared to crush its throat. Dragonite instantly intervened and knocked the Persian away against the wall. Now that it had been subdued, Red ordered the finishing blow. "Dragonite, use Hyper Beam," he yelled. Dragonite took a deep breath before launching a very large and powerful beam at the Persian. The classy cat Pokémon's eyes grew wide with terror as it saw the beam coming closer and closer. The attack then slammed into with the force of a train before exploding. Once the smoke cleared, Persian was out cold. Despite being stronger than the average Persian, it didn't stand a chance against Dragonite's Hyper Beam. Giovanni stood in shock as he had lost again, and this time to Red. He turned to see how the other rockets were faring, and frowned with dismay and hopelessness that they were losing, as well. More and more of his teammates' Pokémon were getting knocked out before the rockets themselves being brought into submission. Giovanni clenched his fists at how hopeless the situation had become. He couldn't believe this. He was the leader of a world-class criminal organization, and now, his ambitions were coming to an end because of that dreadful Ketchum family. Despite this, he couldn't help but feel a small shred of respect for Red and Ash. "Enough!" Giovanni called to his subordinates. The rockets instantly halted their attacks and looked up at their boss. They knew that things looked bad, too. They hoped he had some sort of plan. "Stop attacking. We have lost," Giovanni muttered in defeat. This immediately drew a reaction from the rockets as they started to protest with various shouting. Everyone else, however, breathed a huge sigh of relief. The rocket boss knew he had lost now. "Silence!" Giovanni shouted again, which immediately made them stop. He then turned to Red and Ash. "So it seems that you two have finally bested me. It truly was a spectacular fight, Red. You and Ash are definitely gifted Pokémon trainers and will go far with your careers, though I'm sure Red already has." The two said nothing as they continued to stare at Giovanni, wondering what he was going to do next. What he said next completely surprised them, as well as the others. "Having lost my ultimate fighting weapon and to my two biggest enemies, I cannot face my team members without feeling deep shame," Giovanni continued as he started to back up towards the wall where his Persian was. "I am disbanding Team Rocket immediately." "You win, boss. You can't be serious," one rocket exclaimed. "I am serious. We are no more," Giovanni said sternly as he reached his Persian. Red then stepped up. "Does that mean you are going to come quietly with us, Giovanni? If you're lucky, jail is all you will get for the horrible crimes you committed." Giovanni then smiled. "Oh, I don't plan on coming at all. Jail is not a life suited for me. Team Rocket is no more, but I'm not going to come with you at all." Knowing he was planning to get away, Red, Ash, and Blue rushed at him, but it was too late. Giovanni reached into his pocket before withdrawing a small rectangular device and pressing a button. A small area in the floor opened up beneath him, and Giovanni dropped down into it with his Persian. Red and Blue attempted to go after him, but the door had already shut. Blue slammed his fists against the wall and growled that they didn't see this coming. That slime. He got away. Upon seeing their boss gone, and surrounded by a very powerful group of children and adults, the remaining rockets in the room instantly threw their hands up in surrender. There was nothing they could do now unless they wanted to end up worse than they already were. While the adults began to subdue all of the rockets, Ash turned and saw Serena staring at him, a huge smile on her face. Knowing exactly what she was wanting, he ran down the podium away from his dad and towards her. He didn't stop running until he reached her and immediately threw his arms around her. As she hugged him back, Ash remembered what he was going to tell her before Giovanni interrupted them. Maybe now wasn't the best time, but he would be sure to tell her soon. The rest of the group looked on with smiles on their faces. Ash finally let out a huge sigh of relief. Despite Giovanni managing to get away, it was finally over. It was like a huge weight had come off of Ash. The criminal organization of Team Rocket was finally taken down. No more danger of taking over cities, no more evil threats, and best of all, his mom and friends were finally safe and could live in peace, rather than on the run. All right everyone. The police are on their way right now to arrest the remaining rockets. I say we all head back to Pallet Town after this, Blue announced before his eyes shifted to Ash, Serena, Brock, and Misty. As for you four, I thought we made it specifically clear for you to stay at the lab. Yes. That's true, Ash muttered with his head down as he let go of Serena. Blue, Delia muttered sadly, but she was stopped by him holding up his hand. However, I suppose we should all thank you. If it wasn't for you disobeying us, we may not have gotten here to save Delia in time. You really are like Red over there, Blue smirked as he jammed his thumb over in Red's direction, who merely stood there before smirking, as well. Red and Blue had been intense rivals in their childhood, much like how Ash and Gary were. However, the two had since grown up from their childish ways and were the best of friends despite how much they seemed to dislike the other. It was all in good fun and they knew it. Ehehehe. Thanks, Mr. Blue, Ash responded as he rubbed the back of his head. He was cut off as Leaf, Yellow, and Rose ran up to him and almost crushed him in their hugs, which Ash returned. Gary merely watched from the side with a smile on his face like his father, Blue. The reunions were stopped once again as Red approached Ash. Upon seeing him, Rose, Yellow, and Leaf let go of him and stood back to allow the two to speak. Ash said nothing, as he watched his dad come closer and closer. Despite just battling by his side a mere few moments ago, and it was him who clearly saved their lives, Ash still didn't know what to say to Red. Ash, once things settle down here, I would like to talk with you and your mother. I think you two deserve an explanation, Red said. Ash continued to stare back with little emotion in his eyes. This man played such a small part in his early childhood and was wanting to talk now. Ash turned towards his friends and saw them all nod their heads in affirmation before finally seeing his mom join him and rest her hands on his shoulders as she gazed lovingly at Red. Ash, I would like to explain everything to you, too, Delia told him. Ash sighed as he thought he at least owed his dad that much for saving them. If nothing else, his mom seemed to want to talk. She could probably shed more light on her past with Giovanni and his dad. All right. That will be fine, Ash confirmed with a nod. He didn't know what his mom and dad had in store for him, but they were still parents, and he would listen. Visible relief seemed to cross their smiles as they went over to embrace Ash. As Ash hugged them back, he suddenly realized something that didn't seem right. He saw all of the rockets in the room in complete surrender. They were either being held at bay by the group's Pokemon or knocked out. Confusion was etched on his face as he looked around and didn't see any of the rockets he was most familiar with: Jesse, James, Meowth, Butch, Cassidy, and the executives. Had they gotten away, too? Had Giovanni not been the only one to escape? Ash, what's wrong? Serena asked worriedly as she noticed his expression. Everyone else noticed, too, and looked at him curiously. Giovanni wasn't the only rocket who got away, Ash muttered as he looked around, causing the other people, Pikachu and Cubone, to gasp. Serena looked around next and noticed some of their absence, as well. Where were those 5 and the executives? Brock and Misty realized it next as their faces darkened with a grim expression. If those rockets were still on the loose, things might not be so peaceful, after all. Boy, oh boy. Am I glad we hightailed it out of there as soon as those twerps' parents showed up. Meowth exclaimed as they dashed through a few alleyways in Viridian City. Tell me about. It's times like this when I'm not ashamed to be a coward. I won't look good in prison stripes. James added. Quit talking and just keep running. We want to be as far away from that place as we can to escape the police. Jesse exclaimed. As the trio continued to run away, Hans suddenly reached out from a secluded part of the alley and yanked them to the side. The 3 were pulled away off their path and slammed up against one of the walls. As they stared in fear at who could have grabbed them, they realized it was none other than their executives, Archer, Ariana, Proton, and Petrol. A quick glance to the side proved that Cassidy and Butch were against the wall already, as well, and even Professor Namba. Going somewhere? Archer asked dangerously. Jesse gulped before answering. Well, yes. We were just going to run away and live decent lives from now on since the boss disbanded Team Rocket, and hopefully avoid the police in the process. Team Rocket is not disbanded, Ariana asserted. What do you mean? Isn't that what the boss said? We heard him with our own ears. Meowth replied. Are you actually going run away and quit being Team Rocket members because of some kid? Proton growled, but trying to keep his voice down to avoid being overheard. Well, yes. If that's what the boss orders, James answered with a sheepish grin. James was immediately silenced as he was punched across the face by Proton. He rubbed his sore cheek and glanced woefully at the Team Rocket executives. A bruise was clearly forming where he was hit. Jesse and Meowth glanced worriedly at James, but didn't say anything for fear of their wrath. You idiot. We still have a special battalion of rocket agents on standby awaiting further orders. Weren't you listening to Giovanni when he gave orders to abandon the headquarters? Proton growled. So what did you have in mind? Jesse asked to draw the executive's attention away from James' foolish comment. Just because our boss is gone doesn't mean we can't still be Team Rocket, Petrol said. That's right. He may have disbanded Team Rocket, but we can still stir up trouble at other places, and all of you are going to help us, Proton smirked as he gestured to Jesse. James, Meowth, Cassidy, Butch, and Namba. How are we going to do anything here? The police are bound to look for any remaining Rocket members. How would we get away from everything? James timidly asked in fear. Being struck again. Thankfully, it didn't come. With the police and Pokemon League organization breathing down our necks, it will be hard to get anything done in Kanto, Ariana stated. That's right. We shall leave this region and go someplace where we aren't as well known. We will go someplace where we can rebuild our forces and announce a glorious comeback. Archer declared. Giovanni will return. We refuse to be disbanded because of some brat and his friends. It is too disgraceful. Team Rocket has had a mere setback, but we refuse to go down like this, Proton added. So where are we going? Jesse asked in curiosity. Could they really disobey the boss' direct orders to disband Team Rocket like this? Well, she supposed he wasn't their boss anymore, but still. We're heading to Johto, Archer replied darkly as he narrowed his eyes. Evening was approaching, and it had been over an hour since the police had arrived at the Viridian City Gym. They were still clearing the place of all the rockets and searching around the building for any that could possibly be hiding. Another battalion of police were at their former headquarters to take any dangerous devices they left behind. Ash didn't say much as he stared at the building in front of him, Pikachu on his shoulder. This had probably been the most intense day he had ever experienced in his life. Giovanni had been the gym leader of Viridian City all along. It had been full of too many close calls, and Ash was both physically and mentally exhausted. He had rushed straight to the Viridian gym to rescue his mom. He learned a devastating secret about the connection between Giovanni and his parents. He won his final gym match after a long and arduous battle, and to top everything off, his father, Red, showed up. Hey, Ash, a voice said behind him. Ash and Pikachu both turned around to see Leaf, Gary, and Serena smiling at him, each holding a bottle of water. Cubone was next to them. Serena was holding an extra one in her other hand before handing it to Ash. He graciously accepted the drink before unscrewing the cap and taking a long draught of it. It felt very refreshing as it rushed down his dry throat. So it's finally over, Serena began. Yeah. I think it is, Ash confirmed. It was true that the executives and a few other rockets were missing, but everyone doubted they could cause too much trouble without the leadership of Giovanni. However, the police assured them that they would be on the lookout since they knew their descriptions. Ash then smiled as he opened his jacket and saw his latest achievement. All 8 of the Kanto badges were pinned to the inside of his jacket, and what a beauty they were to behold. He now qualified to be entered in the Pokémon League. If it wasn't for the other events that happened today, Ash would probably be leaping for joy. Still, all of them held a very special meaning in his heart, but it was the newest badge he collected, the Earth badge, that held the most meaning. It was a symbol of how he defeated the boss of Team Rocket in a 6-on-6 match, and he would make sure to remember this day for the rest of his life. Those badges look really good on you, Leaf said with a smile. Thanks, Ash smiled back before something occurred to him. I'm glad you and Gary are okay. What happened exactly? Well, put quite simply, I decided to go on and head off to the Viridian City Gym to get my 8th badge. I got tired of waiting for you to catch up, Ashy boy, Gary started arrogantly but was elbowed by Leaf in the side. As Gary grunted in pain, Leaf finished for him. We all rode to the Viridian Gym in Gary's convertible to watch his match. Yeah, Gary added as he picked it back up. We got into the gym, and it started off just like any other match with gym leader. I thought the man sounded familiar, but didn't think anything of it. So you didn't know the gym leader was Giovanni while you were battling him? Ash asked. I couldn't tell because he was in the shadows most of the match. The battle I had with him was exceedingly easy. I couldn't help but feel he was toying with me during the match. But against my better judgment, I taunted him, and he seemed to get angry, Gary explained. Ash and Serena both cocked their heads to the side in confusion. Giovanni toyed with Gary Oak during an official gym match. What was he playing at? Ash's gym battle with Giovanni had been anything but kidding around. Anyway, I defeated his 3 Pokémon, and he gave me the Earth badge, Gary continued. He then asked me to face his strongest Pokémon, but I declined it. His strongest Pokémon? Was it Rhyperior? Ash asked curiously. Now it was Gary and Leaf's turn to give Ash a look of confusion. A Rhyperior? No way that was it. Where did you hear something like that? Gary wondered. Ash, Pikachu, Serena, and Cubone exchanged glances with each other upon hearing that. Rhyperior wasn't Giovanni's strongest Pokémon? If not, what was it? It became quite clear that Giovanni wasn't just planning on letting us walk away from his gym, Leaf said. He told us that we would have to defeat his strongest Pokémon in order to leave. What was this Pokémon like? Serena inquired. Gary and Leaf looked down at the ground with a grim expression on their faces before going on. That is the thing. We didn't get good look at it because it was covered in a lot of armor. Leaf and I went to scan it with our Pokédexes, but it destroyed them right in front of our eyes. Gary told them. It destroyed your Pokédexes. Serena and Ash gasped. That's right. Then Giovanni told Leaf and I that we could use as many Pokémon as we liked against it. Despite us using all of our Pokémon, we were still no match for it. We were knocked out cold and woke up in a prison cell at their base. I don't get. What Pokémon could have done that? Ash wondered. Ash, Gary said seriously. The Pokémon we're talking about is Mewtwo. Surely you saw it in there like we did. Didn't Giovanni use it against you? Ash and Serena's eyes both widened as they tried to jog their memories on where they heard the name Mewtwo before. If they weren't mistaken, they believed Giovanni mentioned it to them when they first encountered him at the Sylph Company. He said they were working on creating the world's most powerful Pokémon, and needed the Master Ball in case something went wrong. They had succeeded? Gary, I didn't face Mewtwo in there, Ash replied as his face paled. He said his most powerful Pokémon was Rhyperior before sending it out. It wasn't there. Leaf asked in confusion. You mean you didn't defeat it? No. I never even saw it. This is the first time I'm hearing about it, Ash said. So that means Team Rocket succeeded in getting Mewtwo. Wait a second, Gary interrupted as he held right hand up. You mean to tell me you were in a fight for your life as well as everyone else against Giovanni, and he didn't use Mewtwo against you? Ash suddenly realized the truth of Gary's words as it dawned on him. Something was definitely wrong. If Giovanni did indeed have Mewtwo in his possession, why not use it? Ash was certain Giovanni would have wanted to kill him and his friends with that Pokémon, but Giovanni didn't even make a mention of Mewtwo in the gym. No. We never saw it, Serena answered for Ash. The four humans all looked at each other as they realized the same thing. If Ash didn't see Mewtwo inside the gym, and all of the police made no mention of something strange in the gym, that meant that Mewtwo was still out there. This was not good at all. Guys, I have a bad feeling about this. If Mewtwo is cloned from the legendary Pokémon, Mew, and it isn't at the Viridian Gym anymore, then that means it's roaming the earth somewhere, free to do what it wants, Ash said nervously. Everyone took a sharp intake of breath upon hearing that, unsure of how to proceed. They didn't know whether to mention this to the others or not. There was already so much they were dealing with and didn't need another unsettling piece of information so soon. This was no doubt an extremely serious issue. If Mewtwo wasn't at the gym anymore, where would it be? Furthermore, what was its purpose for leaving the gym, and what was its purpose now? Despite how much the group wanted to believe it, they had a feeling. Gary and Leaf's encounter with Mewtwo wouldn't be the last time they saw that Pokémon. After all the events that had happened, everyone in the group believed it would be a good gesture to go visit Riley at the Viridian Hospital. Despite knowing his condition was stable, he could still use some company. In order not to overwhelm him, everyone was visiting him in small groups at a time, at most 3, not including Pokémon. First, it had been Yellow, Rose, and Blue that had gone to see him. Next had been Serena, Cubone, Brock, and Misty. Third were Leaf and Gary, and the last group to enter was Ash, Pikachu, Delia, and Red. As the 3 humans and 1 Pokemon entered the hospital room, they all smiled once they saw Riley was sitting up. He was in obvious discomfort, but for the most part looked okay. For some reason, the group felt another presence in the room as they entered, but realizing it wasn't hostile, they pushed it aside. Riley gave a nod and smiled back to all of them as they entered. "Hey, Riley. How's it going?" Ash asked. "Well, I could be doing better," Riley answered truthfully. "Oh right. I guess that was a stupid question," Ash replied while rubbing the back of his head. "You know I'm just kidding, Ash. I'm doing much better. The bullet was able to miss anything vital, so I'll definitely live," Riley told them. "Oh, thank goodness," Delia breathed in relief as she placed her hand over her heart. "Delia, I'm sorry," Riley suddenly said as he stared ahead to avoid eye contact with them. "I should have been more aware of my surroundings and—" "Riley, you don't have to apologize," Delia said. "It's okay. I promise. Team Rocket is a vile organization that will use any type of method to get what they want. You aren't to blame." Riley gave a sigh of relief and smiled as Red decided to speak next. "It was actually Riley who was able to contact me and inform me of the situation once Delia was captured," he said. "Really? How was Uncle Riley able to get in touch with you when no one else was?" Ash wondered curiously. "It's just another gift aura users share with each other," Riley replied for him. "We are able to establish connections with each other through our aura no matter where the other is. Red was on his way the moment I contacted him." "That's so cool. Will I get to do that one day?" Ash asked hopefully. "Absolutely. I'll be happy to teach you when the time comes," Red told him. Ash's face noticeably darkened once Red said that. "How will you be able to teach me if you are always away?" he muttered. It was like the temperature in the room dropped a few degrees once Ash said that. Delia, Riley, and Red all glanced at each other and frowned. It seems Ash's bitter feelings about Red were worse than they thought. Despite Delia and Riley's efforts to ensure Ash that Red loved him, it was still found difficult for him to grasp. It was clear the only one who could ease Ash's doubt about Red was Red himself. "Pika Pika," Pikachu said as it patted its trainer on the back. "Ash, I know I don't see you as often as we both would like, but that doesn't mean I don't care. I have my reasons, and it's for your best interest. I'm not doing this out of lack of care or responsibility," Red said seriously. "What is it then?" Ash demanded as he turned around to face Red. "What could be so important in your life that you don't have time to spend with Mom and me?" Red noticeably sighed once Ash told him that. He knew that if he told Ash the reason, that the information would never leave the room. He could certainly trust his son and Delia to keep a secret, but that wasn't the issue. Someone could be listening in, or even the slightest slip or hint of what Red was doing to the wrong people could lead to disaster. "Ash, unfortunately, I can't tell you that," Red answered. "I would like to, believe me, but now just isn't the time." "I thought so," Ash muttered as he shifted his gaze away from Red to the floor. "Ash, it isn't like that," Red said firmly. "It's not that I'm not telling you to be selfish. It's that I can't tell you unless I put you and Delia in danger." This caught Ash's attention. His eyes snapped from looking at the floor to back at Red. Where had he heard that before? It sounded a lot like how Ash wouldn't tell his mom of the danger she was in for Team Rocket to avoid alarming her. It was like Red wasn't telling them in order to protect them. "What do you mean?" Ash finally asked. "I mean I can't tell you for you and your mom's safety. If word got out, you could both be in danger," Red answered. So Red wasn't being selfish? He was doing this for the good of his family. What could Red possibly be keeping secret from Ash and Delia that would put them in danger if word got Out. Seeing the troubled look on Ash's face, Red continued. It's not like it would be for certain you would be in danger, but it's for the best that few people know as possible. I just don't want to take the chance. I'm just being cautious. Ash felt a little bit better after Red told him that. At least he knew they weren't in any immediate danger from this. Still though, if Red said it's best if few people know as possible. Did that mean anyone knew beside Red? Feeling compelled to ask the question, Ash spoke up. So does anyone know what your reason is? Ash asked. Red exchanged glances with Riley as if wondering how he should answer that. After nodding to each, Red decided there would be no harm in answering that question. There are a few. Both Blue and Riley know, but they pretend they don't for obvious reasons. I have the feeling Rose and Yellow know even though I haven't specifically told them. There are a few select people in other regions that know, too, Red answered. So not even Mom knows, Ash mumbled as he looked in thought. Ash, even though I'm not for certain what it is, I still know your father loves us, Delia spoke up. He is a wonderful man, and it's because of him that I am who I am now. Ash suddenly thought back to all the words people had said about Red in order to defend him. They always spoke so highly of him. They always told Ash that Red loved him no matter what. Was it really the truth the entire time? Even his mom was telling him this. She said that despite his infrequent visits, Red still loved him. Ash then began having flashbacks to how much time he and Red spent together when Ash was younger. They did nearly everything together. They played together, and Red would always tell Ash stories of his greatest Pokemon battles or experiences. Then one day, when Ash was 6 years old, Red left, saying he had business to take care of. Ever since Red left, Ash had felt a sense of betrayal. It was like all the great things his father and him had done together were washed away. With his father only visiting once a year, Ash felt he didn't have a father at all, and even pretended he didn't. He never mentioned the man unless someone else brought it up first. Now, Ash was starting to see his father in a whole new light. What everyone said about Red seemed to be true. He stayed away from Ash to protect him, not because he didn't care. What really did it for Ash is when Red came and placed his hands on Ash's shoulders. He looked Ash straight in the eye and gave him a serious expression. I promise that if I could see you every day, I would. I think about you all of the time and am always wondering how you are doing. You are the apple of my eye, and I love you. Son. Do you believe me? Red spoke. Ash stared right back into his father's eyes and found no trace of deception. He once again remembered all the good times he and his father shared before he left. He remembered all of the pictures in his house of them together. Red really was telling the truth. Dad, I believe you. I love you, too, Ash finally said as tears came to his eyes. Red felt a lump in his throat at Ash's words. His son was actually accepting him once again. Despite Red's attempts to visit Ash in the past, Ash would grow increasingly distant. With each subsequent visit, Red tried to assure Ash, but it would fail. Now, it was like a great weight had been lifted from Red's shoulders to know that Ash was beginning to understand. Thank you, Ash. I'm sorry, Red said as he finally went up and hugged his son, which Ash returned. You shouldn't have to apologize, Dad. It was me who didn't understand. I'll accept a visit from you anytime, Ash replied. Delia, Pikachu, and Riley watched the scene with a smile on their faces. It was great to see the relationship between Ash and Red being repaired. It was just an intense misunderstanding. Now they could be a family once again. There was still one loose end that needed to be tied up. He had to know his parents' full past with Giovanni. Mom. Ash spoke as he broke away from his dad. There's one thing I don't get. How could you have ended up with a man like Giovanni? Delia cast her eyes downward once Ash asked her that question. She should have known it was coming. She looked back up and stared in her son's eyes and could see the hurt in them. She needed to come clean herself. As I said before, Ash, I'm not proud of my past. Your father and I have known each other since we were kids. He always had loved me, but I rejected his advances. I always told him I wasn't sure of how I felt about him or was leading him on by a string. It was then I met Giovanni, Delia said and then paused for a moment. Ash nodded his head for his mom to continue. Taking a deep breath, she did. She knew it wasn't easy for her son to listen to this, but now that it was out in the open, he had to know the full story. Once I met Giovanni, I saw so many attractive qualities in him. He was handsome, of course. He was ambitious, and a natural leader. I was too enamored by those things to notice how evil Giovanni truly was. As a result, I slowly started to become like him after spending enough time with him, Delia said. Ash clenched his teeth and shut his eyes as Mom continued. He thought it would be a little easier hearing it a second time, but it wasn't. It was just so hard to believe that his mother was once like this. He knew the worst part of the story was coming up. We then started forming our group together, and we called it Rocket, Delia finished. Ash exhaled after a held breath. There, his mom said it. Now he could begin the process of coming to terms with the truth. He felt Pikachu give him a reassuring pat on the back. Once more. Ash faced his mom once again. She was staring back with tears in her eyes with an unsure look as if wondering whether she should continue. Ash nodded his head once again to signal for her to. It wasn't long after we formed the small group that we had a child together, a son, Delia explained. When we had our child, it opened my eyes to what kind of man Giovanni really was and what I had been doing. I tried to talk to Giovanni, but he wouldn't listen, and he stated that he wanted our son to follow in his footsteps. I couldn't expose our son to the things Giovanni was doing, so I ran away. So that means I have a half-brother, Ash said. It was a statement rather than a question. That's right, Delia confirmed. That was when I met up again with Red. Despite the horrible things I had done to him in the past, he still loved me and was so understanding. Pretty soon, I began to love him back, and he changed me for the better. Red then went over and gave Delia an affectionate hug from behind. Delia responded by bringing up her hands to hold onto his arms. Ash wasn't usually one for love gestures, but this was rather sweet and was an emotional moment. Red then took our child in as his own. He loved him just as much as any real father. We lived in Viridian City after that. For a while, it seemed like our son was truly happy, and then, the truth was found out by him, Delia finished. What happened? Ash wondered. Delia and Red both sighed about what had happened that horrible night. They did their best to try to forget this terrible memory, but couldn't. It was always permanently etched in their minds. It was then Delia began to tell what happened almost 12 years ago. It was nighttime in Viridian City. The moon had just begun to peak now that the sun was completely down. Delia Ketchum was washing the dishes in her kitchen while her husband, Red, was helping get their son ready for bed. It had been another wonderful day in the Ketchum family. They had all been at the Pokemon League that week to watch the participants. Their son had been extremely excited the entire time they were there and declared he wanted to be Pokemon trainer by the time he was 10. Once they got home earlier this evening, Delia had cooked a large dinner. Despite there being just 3 of them, there were still not any leftovers. Her husband and son always made sure of that. Delia smiled to herself at how wonderful her life had become now that Red was here. She was so stupid to not have seen beforehand what a wonderful man he was. She didn't know how she could have put up with a man like Giovanni for so long. The only positive thing that had come from that was the birth of her son, but now that was behind her, and she could move forward. Nothing could happen. There was suddenly a loud knock at the door, drawing Delia's attention away from the dishes. She then heard the voice of her husband. "Could you get that, dear? My hands are a little tied up right now," Red called from upstairs. "Of course," Delia called back as she took off her gloves and set them down before heading to the door. It was really curious that someone was coming by at this hour. It was almost 9 o'clock at night. Who on earth could that be? As Delia opened the door to greet who was outside, her heart jumped into her throat, and she found herself unable to speak. Despite not seeing the person in quite a while, Delia was still able to recognize the man as he hadn't changed at all. Standing at the other end of the doorway was none other than Giovanni. Beside him was a man with short green hair and a woman with red hair. They must be two of his people that were in that group he formed, if he still had it. Nevertheless, these two people didn't look the least bit friendly. "Good evening, Delia," Giovanni greeted with a sinister smile. Delia was still unable to speak due to the complete shock of seeing the man she was hoping to never lay eyes on again. How on earth had he found her? "Well? Aren't you going to invite me in? I've spent almost 8 years searching for you. Who would have known you were in Viridian City the entire time?" Giovanni asked with mock expectancy. Giovanni," Delia stuttered. "Sweetheart? Who's at the door?" Red called from upstairs. Upon hearing the voice, Giovanni's eyes instantly narrowed and his false friendly expression morphed into a scowl. He let out a growl underneath his breath upon hearing the voice of the man he so hated. He made a slight motion with his head to the two people beside him. The two swept away their trench coats and their hands grabbed onto the pokeballs in case it was necessary. Delia froze once she saw the two were armed with pokeballs. She had no doubt that Giovanni had a couple, as well. "Delia!" Red called again after not receiving a response and came down the stairs himself to see who was at the door. Upon seeing who it was, Giovanni and Red immediately locked eyes. Red frowned and gave Giovanni a hard glare. "What are you doing here?" Red demanded. "I am here to see my son, of course. Is that so wrong?" Giovanni growled back. "You aren't welcome here." "Leave," Red uttered in low tone. "I don't think you have the power to tell me what I can and can't do with my own son," Giovanni replied darkly. "As a matter of fact, I can," Red stated. "I've adopted the child as my own, and we aren't going to let him go with the likes of you." "Heh, is that so? I guess I will have to get him by force, then," Giovanni stated as gave the signal to his two subordinates. "Archer, Ariana, take care of these two while I find the boy." Archer and Ariana sent out a wheezing and Arbok, respectively. It was making a very tight fit in the smaller foyer of the house. The two Pokemon pinned Delia against the wall, while Red leaped out of the way just in time. Giovanni and the two other humans then forced their way in the house to look for the child, but Red was already to his feet and had a Pokeball drawn. "Go, Snorlax!" he yelled as he released the large and fat Pokemon. While most Snorlax would only love to sleep and eat, Red had really trained his to where it was ready to battle at a moment's notice. The Arbok and wheezing sweat dropped at seeing the very angry Snorlax. "Get them out of here, Snorlax!" Red yelled. Snorlax then charged forward faster than one would expect. Footsteps thudded heavily on the floor with each step. It then crashed into the Arbok and wheezing, sending them flying out the door. The Snorlax then squeezed through the doorway itself. Taking a brief second to look at Delia see if she was okay, Red followed. Delia looked to see where Giovanni and the two others had gone, and her eyes widened in fear as she saw they weren't there. She then cast her eyes towards the direction of the stairs and heard footsteps going up them. Without a second thought, she ran after them. She knew they must be heading to her son's room. She dashed as fast as she could to the room to discover the door was already opened. She ran the rest of the way and entered. To have an arm suddenly stick out in the way of her neck. Delia was clotheslined and knocked to the floor. In pain, she looked up to see her attacker was Ariana, who was leering down at her along with Archer. She slowly sat up and her eyes watered when she saw Giovanni holding their son out in front of him with a hand over his mouth. The boy's eyes were widened with fear as he looked towards his mom for help. Delia made to stand up, but was quickly apprehended by Ariana and Archer as they grabbed her by the arms. "Just leave him alone. Please, Giovanni," Delia pleaded. "Once again, I'm just paying a visit to my son," Giovanni smirked. Upon hearing this, the boy's eyes widened as he turned to look in shock at the man that was holding him captive. "What? They never told you? Surely you knew that Red wasn't your real father?" "That would be none other than me, Giovanni," he announced as he smirked at his son. "You've been living in a lie so far, boy." The boy then turned to Delia as if begging to say this man was lying. Despite how much she wanted to, Delia couldn't bring herself to lie directly to him like that when he was staring straight in her eyes. "He's speaking the truth. He is your father," Delia answered, full of regret as she was held back by Giovanni's two subordinates. The boy's eyes held such hurt and betrayal at being lied to this whole time, and then, contempt. Upon seeing the devastated look, Giovanni's dark smile grew wider. "Ah, that look in your eyes. They seem to possess much hate and anger. You will make a fine member of Team Rocket one day." "Team Rocket?" Delia questioned. Before the conversation could go any further, there was a loud boom as everyone's eyes drew towards the doorway to the bedroom. Red and his Snorlax were both standing there, with a look that could kill. Upon knowing that their Pokémon had been knocked out and they couldn't stand up to Snorlax, Ariana and Archer released Delia and ran towards the nearby window before busting it open. Giovanni growled as he let go of his son and followed after them. He would have to bring an army next time to handle Red. Before he left from the window, he turned back to Delia and Red with a warning. "Don't think this is the last you saw of me. I know where you are, Delia, and I will always be searching. You cannot keep my son from me," Giovanni uttered. He then cast one more look towards the boy on the floor who was still reeling from the whole ordeal, and with that he was gone. Red breathed a sigh of relief before patting his Snorlax on the shoulder and returning it to its pokeball. Delia then ran over to hug her son who slowly wrapped his arms around her back. "Are you all right, sweetie?" Delia asked as she hugged him. "Yeah. I'm okay," the 8-year-old boy responded. Then in remembrance of what had happened, an angry look entered his eyes. "Leave me alone." "I'm sorry," Delia asked as she gave her son a questioning look. "I said leave me alone. You both have lied to me. My father is that bad person, isn't he?" the boy muttered. Red and Delia exchanged glances with each other with a look of regret. They both turned back to the boy and nodded their heads. "It's true, but we were doing it out of love. It was for your best interest. I couldn't bear the thought of you knowing the truth," Delia pleaded as she went to hug her son again, but he pulled away. He gave hard glare before facing away from them and muttered, "I want you both to leave. I want to be by myself." With tears in her eyes, Delia left along with Red. Red, himself, looked very hurt, as well at seeing the sudden change the boy's demeanor towards them. They slowly left the room, leaving the boy to his thoughts. Even then, that was the time first Red and I got word about Team Rocket becoming the organization that it eventually evolved into, and Giovanni being involved with it. Despite this, there was no way I knew Giovanni would be their leader, Delia told Ash. That's right. We were unsure due to lack of evidence, Riley spoke up. It wasn't until you told me that their leader's name was Giovanni did we fit all of the pieces together. Ash nodded his head as he didn't blame them now for not knowing. He wanted to know more about his half-brother now. So what happened after that with my brother? He asked. Ever since that day, he just grew more and more distant from us. His distant personality soon turned to outright anger and bitterness, Delia continued. We tried to prove to him that we loved him, but he rejected everything Red and I did. The only thing he could think about was how he was the son of a criminal. So where is he now? Ash wondered. He left on his Pokemon journey about a year before you were born, Red answered. We tried to stop him and wanted to make peace with him, but all he said was he was glad he was going and wasn't coming back. We haven't seen or heard from him since then. Ash nodded his head as he took in all of this information. He didn't quite what to know or make of the situation. So he had a half-brother whom never knew about? His mother was once with Giovanni and even helped create the organization. As much as he didn't want to admit it, that was just a part of his mother's life that even she would like to forget. Ash, both Red and I love you so much, and we don't want you go the same path as our other son did. Please, Delia said as she gazed pleading at her son. Even Red had a solemn expression his face as he stared at Ash. Ash took a look at each of them. So these were his parents. One was a father who never had much to do with him in his older years, but just proved it was for his own good and still loved him. Then the other was a mother who once had a wild streak with Giovanni and unknowingly helped create the criminal organization of Team Rocket. This was their past whether they or Ash liked it or not. What's done is done, and that has no bearing on who they are now. If he were to ever accept his parents again, he would need to accept that part of them, too. Taking a shuddering breath, Ash nodded his head. He believed them and could let go of their obviously horrible past. He went over to them and embraced both of them, having fully forgiven them. Upon seeing the gesture from their son, tears came to both of their eyes as they hugged him back. It was a truly joyous reunion. The truth was out, and now that they had talked about it, everyone could finally put the past behind them and move forward. No more dark secrets or hiding the truth. The Ketchum family's relationship had been repaired. Riley and Pikachu stared once more at the scene with smiles on their face. It was great to see that everything was okay between them now. While he was hugging his parents, there was one thing left that Ash didn't know that he was really curious about. Looking up towards his mom and Red, he asked the last thing that was on his mind. About my brother, he began. None of you ever mentioned what his name was. Delia looked down and smiled sadly at Ash. Oh, his name. Delia repeated. Upon receiving a nod from Ash, Delia took a deep breath to say a name she hadn't mentioned in a very long time. His name was Silver. Ash stepped out of Riley's hospital room where he saw his friends, Serena, Brock, Misty, Gary, and Leaf were waiting for him. Delia and Red were still in the room to talk to Riley about a few more things. When Ash asked what it was, Red gave him a wink and said he would know in due time. Despite this, Ash gave each of his friends a warm smile in greeting, and they smiled back upon seeing everything went well. Uncle Riley's still doing just fine, Ash assured them. With the way things are going, I bet he'll make a full recovery. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing him say that. It was such great news. Taking that as cue to go further, Ash decided to tell them his other bit of news. And I think that things between my parents and I will be just fine. We've all agreed to put the past behind us and focus on moving forward. There aren't any hard feelings anymore, Ash stated. I'm so glad to hear you say that, Serena said as she went forward and embraced Ash. As Ash returned the hug that Serena was giving him, a sudden thought occurred to him. It was his conversation when Delia was telling Ash about her and Red's childhood. She had led him on a string and the results ended up being disastrous for their future for quite a while. Was that what he was doing with Serena? He had never rejected or accepted her feelings. He finally believed he understood at the gym, but wanted to hold off for a while. Now that he was sure, there was no need to delay. Taking a lesson from his parents, he had to let out what he felt about Serena right now. No more leading her on. Serena, can I talk to you alone for a moment? Ash asked her, but gave her a reassuring smile to let her know it wasn't anything bad. Oh, of course, Ash, Serena replied. Ash then nodded to the rest as Pikachu hopped off of his shoulders and Cubone left Serena's side. He began to lead Serena away from everyone else down one of the corridors. He was looking for what looked like a private place, but it was proving to be difficult in a hospital. There were empty corridors everywhere, but he couldn't find a good spot. Finally, deciding to take a hospital room that wasn't being used, Ash led Serena in and quietly shut the door behind him so as not to disturb anyone nearby. Ash took a deep breath as turned to stare at Serena's beautiful face. He couldn't believe he could ever have these feelings for someone. Everyone had always described him as dense or oblivious, and that was true for the most part. Ever since he turned 11 though, his feelings had begun to change, in particular towards Serena. Now he was certain what he was feeling towards her. So what is it you wanted to talk to me about? Serena asked as she gave Ash an expectant look. Well, Ash chuckled lamely as he rubbed the back of his head. Serena giggled at Ash's antics. It was really cute when he would act embarrassed like that. Despite this, her curiosity was getting the better of her. What is it? She repeated. Ash took another deep breath as looked into Serena's eyes. How should he begin this? He was never good at anything like this. He had no experience and didn't know if he would come off perfect or just really stupid. Maybe he should have practiced with someone first, like Pikachu or Brock. Yeah, right. Serena, Ash started. Remember how I told you on the Ferris wheel how I wasn't sure of my feelings for you yet and couldn't return them? Yes, I remember, Serena replied, her demeanor dropping just slightly. Well, ever since that night, I feel as though we have been growing closer, Ash said. We both saved each other from my Aerodactyl back on Cinnabar Island, and your encouraging words helped me get through my Cinnabar and Saffron gym battle. That's right, Serena agreed as she perked up again after hearing Ash say that. But it was these past couple of days where I really began to understand how important you are, Ash stated. You were there for me when I was completely broken at my house. You were there to comfort me and give me the determination to save my mom. It was you who snapped me out of my shock at learning the truth of my mother's past. I don't know what I would have done in those situations if it wasn't for you. Ash, Serena trailed. Wow, she was getting really warm at hearing Ash say things to her. And then, most recently, I was able to win the battle at Viridian City because of your help. My aura alone wasn't enough for Pikachu and me to defeat Rhyperior, but we did it. Because of the help of the psychic powers we discovered you have. They worked really well with each other just like Uncle Riley and Ms. Yellow said they would. It was all because of you, Serena. It was like we were made for each other, Ash continued. It was Serena who found herself at a loss for words now. She couldn't find anything to say and only found herself staring back into Ash's chocolate brown eyes. Was he actually going to say what she thinks he is going to say? It was then I realized you have always been there for me, more than anybody else, Ash said seriously as he placed his hands on her shoulders. You have always been the one to get me out of any bad situation I may have been in. It was you who would talk to me late at night whenever I would feel doubt about my journey. It was always you. Serena began to get a very hopeful expression on her face. Was Ash going to do it? Was this the moment she had been waiting for ever since she met him? I've finally realized what my feelings are for you, Serena, Ash confirmed. I like you, too, not as friend. I like you how you like me. Ash then exhaled quickly as he began panting. He couldn't believe he actually said that. He didn't think those words could ever come out his mouth, but there they were. Serena had her mouth open as she suddenly felt like she could cry, but out of happiness. Despite how out of breath Ash looked right now, he had really said it. He said the words. She had been waiting so long to hear, and she couldn't be happier at the moment. You like me, too. She choked on her own words. Yes, I do, Ash replied as he once more looked into her eyes and his heart pounded in his chest. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, will you be my girlfriend, Serena? Serena's eyes began to shine with pure joy when Ash asked her that. He actually asked her out? Her dream was coming true. They were going to a couple. She was just about to give her answer when she noticed something. Despite how elated she was, Serena took a good look at her surroundings and burst out laughing. This clearly wasn't the reaction Ash was expecting as he gave her confused look. He just poured his heart out to her for the first time and asked if she would be his girlfriend, and she was laughing? Serena? Ash questioned. You're so funny, Ash. Serena gasped between her fit of giggles. You just confessed that you like me and asked me to be your girlfriend in an empty hospital patient's room. Could this be any more of a strange place to do it in? Ash instantly turned beet red once Serena said that. Maybe in his over-eagerness to tell her his feelings, he did sort of forget that they were in a hospital, and it wasn't really the right place to do it. He was so unromantic. Oh, sorry. I guess this could have played out better, he mumbled as he stared at the floor, still blushing like mad from embarrassment. No, it's fine, Ash, Serena said as she stopped laughing. It's part of how you are. I wouldn't have you any other way. So does that mean? Ash trailed. Yes, Ash. I would love to be your girlfriend. Serena exclaimed as she leaned forward and hugged him as tight as she could. Ash smiled as he hugged Serena back. After all this time, he had made Serena's dream come true, and may have made one come true for himself. He never would have guessed that he would ever find a girlfriend when he started on his Pokemon journey so many months ago, but here he was with a girl who liked him all along. I'm so happy right now, Ash, Serena said sincerely as tears came to her eyes once more. Her last obstacle had been overcome. Ash liked her back. I know. Me, too, Ash replied as they continued to embrace. It took a long while for them to get together, and now they finally were. They had to overcome many obstacles, from encounters from criminal gangs and life-threatening situations, but in the end, they realized they were always there for each other. Now that they were together, they both knew their Pokemon journey was going to be even more unforgettable than it was already. They knew that no matter what lies ahead, they would always be able to overcome it. They were a team. They were together. It was the happiest day of both of their lives. On a faraway island, a massive castle was just shy of being built. Just less than a week earlier, this island had been a total wreck. All that was on the island before were various charred pieces of debris and smoke from the remains of a fire. Despite this, not a trace of any of the previous disaster remained. Mewtwo stood back and looked at its creation. It had built this castle from the ground up from the remaining piles of rocks and dirt that were scattered around. Its psychic powers made it possible to reshape and reconstruct any object, which was how it was able to do this feat in such a short amount of time. Despite this, Mutuo didn't do this to show off its skills. It had a much more sinister purpose. A castle like this was fit for the ruler of the whole world, which is the type of castle Mutuo wanted. Just because it was created by humans didn't mean it had to serve them. Sure, it gave chances for them to treat it as an equal, but they betrayed it each time. Humanity had turned its back on Mutuo, and now Mutuo was going to turn its back on humanity. As Mutuo's eyes glowed to put the last brick in place of the castle, it turned around to stare off at the sea. It was such a sight. Is this what humans considered beautiful? It was. Such a shame. This was one of the few good things in this world. Mutuo's eyes narrowed. It is now time for my revenge on humans. Everyone will answer to me, Mutuo said. A new world order will finally begin. Chapter 49, Mutuo Strikes Back, Part 1. The forest was incredibly quiet at the moment. Not a Pokemon was in sight. It was in some of the deepest depths in a remote part of Kanto, nowhere near any civilization. This made it perfect if one was hiding away, especially in the nearby lake. That something turned out to be a Pokemon. Some would say that this Pokemon is only a myth, but others knew better. Rarely seen, but signs of its existence were everywhere. No one had even seen this Pokemon in over 100 years. Only a strand of its fur was found after so long of searching. That was because this Pokemon had been asleep this whole time. Well, until now. The pink Pokemon slowly opened its eyes. There were very few things that could cause it to awaken, but this was one of them. It sensed a great disturbance about to take place in the world, and the Pokemon knew it was involved. It needed to see what was going on and hopefully put a stop to it. Forming a small pink bubble around itself, the Pokemon slowly rose to the surface of the water. As soon as that happened, it took off at the speed of sound, high into the sky. Mew, the Pokemon cried. Hey, guys, Ash called as he and Serena came back to the group once Ash had made his confession. He and Serena were holding hands, which didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the group. Had it really happened? Delia and Red had since stopped talking to Riley and were now standing out in the waiting room along the others. Serena's eyes widened in surprise when she saw her mother. Grace was there, too. Mom? Serena questioned. Oh, Serena. Thank goodness you're okay. Grace cried as she ran forward to embrace her daughter. You have no idea how worried I was when you had run off to the Viridian gym. I'm sorry, Mom, Serena replied as she let go of Ash's hand to return the hug. I just couldn't let Ash go there by himself. Young lady. That was an incredibly reckless thing to do. You could have been killed, and then. Grace continued hysterically until she felt a hand rest on her shoulder. She turned and saw it had been Ash's mom, Delia, who had done it. Your daughter was very brave to come help me when I was in trouble. I was disapproving of it as well when I saw them, but it's thanks to them that everything worked out in the end, Delia said while giving Grace a gentle smile. Heh, yeah. If it wasn't for them, we may not have been able to get rid of Team Rocket. Crazy kids, Blue mumbled. Grace looked back and forth between the adults and other kids in the room. She realized that everyone was just as worried for their kids as she was when they left. Unlike the other adults, Grace was powerless to do anything. She had been a great Rehorn racer back in the day, but had not done any serious battling at all since Serena was born. Maybe that's why she had been more upset and worried than the others. As much as Grace didn't want to admit it, she believed that Serena's recklessness and crazy, rash decisions didn't come from being influenced by Ash alone. It had also come from her father. She was glad that she had run away with Serena when she did to the Kanto region. Grace finally let out a sigh as she looked back down at her daughter. Sweetie, I'm just glad that you're okay. I know, Mom. I'm sorry, Serena said again. Grace should have known that Serena would do anything for Ash just like he would do for her. Those two really were close and this adventure had only gotten them closer. Wait. Did that explain why the two were holding hands? Anyway, Ash spoke up, drawing the attention back to himself. Serena and I have something to tell all of you. Oh? What is it? Delia asked as she and everyone else gave them an expectant look. Well, Ash began as he scratched his cheek and turned red. Serena and I, we're a couple. Serena finished with delight and gave Ash a hug. The effect was almost immediate. It was as if the group was expecting it. That's so awesome. Leaf squealed as she ran over and practically tackled both Ash and Serena in a massive hug. Slow down, Leaf. Ash managed to say as he tried to push the excited girl off of him and Serena. As Leaf got off of them, Brock and Misty were next as they each gave their friends and sibling-like hug. Well, Brock technically gave Ash a nudgie. Attaboy, Ash. Brock said as Ash tried to pull away. Pikachu and Cubone dashed forward and leaped into their arms. They then gave each other one big hug. Because Asha and Serena were now a couple, they were almost like a real family. Ash then turned towards his backpack as he knew the egg was still in there. Once it hatched, they would be even more like a family. Delia and Grace had tears of joy in their eyes while Gary and the rest of the adults smiled in approval. They were just as excited as everyone else but were more low-key. Yes. Most of the people in the room had been waiting for that for quite a while. It was certain on Serena's part how she felt about him, but poor, oblivious Ash had never caught on. His Pokemon journey had really allowed him to grow up, though. It was true he was getting a little older, which was causing him to mature, but it was being more responsible for himself and being in so many perilous situations that had forced him to grow up. In a way, it had all been good for him in the very end. Now, he had finally realized his feelings for Serena. It was now the next day at the hospital in Viridian City. With all the events that had happened the previous day, the kids of the group decided it was best to spend the night at the hospital rather than return home. Despite Yellow living in Viridian City, there simply wasn't enough room at her house for everyone. Not to mention, Ash's house was still damaged and would remain uninhabitable until it was able to be repaired. Grace had graciously opened her house up for the Ketchums, as well as Brock and Misty, to stay in during this time. Ash and Serena, of course, had no objections to this, but Grace slyly told them that she would be watching the two for any funny business. Both Ash and Serena blushed extremely deep upon hearing that until Grace said she was just kidding. Ash was heading towards the cafeteria in the hospital for breakfast as he went down the elevator with Pikachu on his shoulder. It had been the most peaceful sleep he had in quite a while. Everyone was safe. Team Rocket was gone. He had all 8 badges. He reconciled his relationship with his mom and dad after learning their past, and he and Serena were finally couple. His night was full of blissful dreams. Despite knowing that Mutuo was still out there somewhere, that was the furthest thing from his mind at the moment. Pika Pie. Pikachu asked as it saw Ash's peaceful expression. Why am I so happy, you ask? How could I not? Ash replied back with a grin. Pie Pikachu, Pikachu said. Ash smiled as he got the gist of what Pikachu was saying. Yes. I'm looking forward to seeing Serena this morning, also. It's going to be our first full day together. Pikachu. Pikachu asked hopefully. How would I know if you'll get a girlfriend one day? Ash asked with a roll of his eyes as the elevator opened up. The pair then walked out of the elevator onto the first floor of the hospital where the cafeteria was located. He wasn't surprised if he would be the last one in as usual. Both his Mom and Dad were already out of Riley's room by the time Ash got up, to which Riley said they had already gone to eat and would bring something back up for him. As Ash entered the cafeteria, and as expected, everyone else was already there. He grabbed a tray before sliding it down where the friendly worker put some scrambled eggs and bacon on his plate. He then made sure to get some ketchup for Pikachu before heading over to where everyone was at. He spotted Serena sitting with Leaf, Gary, Brock, and Misty, and headed that way. As Serena saw Ash approaching, she gave him a warm smile while her cheeks tinged pink. "Good morning, Ash," she greeted. "Heh heh, same to you," Ash replied back. They continued to stare at each other, taking in their appearances. Ash didn't know if it was because if Serena was his girlfriend or nor, but she looked extra alluring today despite dressing the same as normal. Leaf, Brock, and Misty let out a light giggle while Gary rolled his eyes. Were these two just going to stare at each other all day or actually eat? After what seemed like forever, Ash and Serena finally snapped out of it and Ash quickly sat down in the empty chair next to Serena. Pikachu hopped off of his shoulder and joined. Cubone. Ash then took the Pokemon egg he had gotten on Cinnabar Island out of his backpack to finally show it to Leaf and Gary since they hadn't seen it yet. "Wow, check that out. Where did you get it, Ash?" Gary asked curiously as he inspected the egg through the incubator. "We got it from a scientist on Cinnabar Island. He said they found it in the depths of Cinnabar Island and said I would be a good trainer for the Pokemon inside of here," Ash responded. "So what Pokemon do you think is inside of it?" Leaf wondered. "I really don't know. I've never seen a Pokemon with a design like this before, and the scientist wouldn't tell me," Ash replied. "That egg should be pretty close to hatching by now," Brock added as an afterthought. "I mean the scientists had it a long time while they were studying it, and we've had it for a while, also." "Yeah," Ash agreed as he looked at the egg. "I'm sure Professor Oak would like to take a good look at this egg. When we get back to Pallet Town, I'll be sure to show him." "Ah, Pallet Town," Leaf sighed as she leaned back in her chair with a blissful smile. "I can't wait to go back home." "I know, right? Since we are done with our travels for right now, we are going to be in Pallet Town for a while," Serena said. "Right. Now that I've got all 8 badges, it's time to get some heavy-duty training in to prepare for the Pokemon League," Ash said with determination. "Pikachu!" Pikachu cheered from the side after looking up from its ketchup. "Heh! You better get as much in as you can. The Pokemon League is only a month away," Gary smirked. "I know that, Gary. Trust me. I'll be ready, and I'm going to win it," Ash stated while he pumped his fist in the air. "Well, I give you credit for your enthusiasm, but it will be impossible for you win the Pokemon League," Gary said as he crossed his arms. Ash turned to glare at Gary before the spiky brown-haired boy added with a grin, "You will just have to settle for second place because I'm going to win it." "I don't think so, Gary. My Pokemon and I are going to train extra hard for this. We are definitely going to win," Ash replied as he returned the friendly gesture. "Well, I'm going to be training extra hard, too," Gary said before adding. "In fact, what do you say to a quick Pokemon battle to start our training off with?" "You got it?" Ash exclaimed. "Let's have one as soon as breakfast is over." "Slow down, Ash. There isn't exactly a convenient place to have a Pokemon battle in a hospital," Misty pointed out. "There's a court out back here at the hospital. We can have our battle there," Gary replied with a shrug. "Sounds good to me," Ash exclaimed, getting fired up. He could hardly wait. Everyone was gathered around on the court in the back of the hospital. They were all eager to see that battle between Ash and Gary. The last time the two had a battle was back in Saffron City a few months ago. They had both grown tremendously as Pokemon trainers since that time, and they were now going to put their training to the test. Not to mention, each of their parents were watching the match, so that made it even more important that they won for family pride. Brock stood in the middle and decided to be the judge for the match. Red smiled and elbowed Blue in the side. "Hey, Blue. Doesn't this remind you of you and me when we were kids?" "Does it ever?" Blue replied back with a rare smile. "It's almost as if we are looking at younger versions of ourselves." "They definitely are our kids." "It's just like the old days," Rose added. "Are both trainers ready to choose their Pokemon?" Brock asked in an authoritative voice. "You bet. I'll go first," Ash shouted with enthusiasm. "Tauros, I choose you." The wild bull Pokemon appeared from the Pokeball and let out a loud moo. It then pawed the ground with its hooves, ready to battle. "Hey. That Tauros looks nice and strong," Gary complimented. "Let's see if can handle my Arcanine." "Let's go." Gary threw the Pokeball as the large dog-like Pokemon appeared from the Pokeball and let out a howl to get itself pumped up for the battle. Ash figured this must be the same Growlithe he faced back in Saffron City, only now it had evolved since then. Well, he was determined to beat it this time. This will be a one-on-one match between Ash and Gary. There will be no time limit. "Begin," Brock announced. "Quick, Arcanine. Use Dig," Gary shouted. The Arcanine gave a howl and quickly burrowed underground, leaving a large hole, but Ash already knew how he was going to deal with it. "It's underground, Tauros. Now is the perfect time to use Earthquake," Ash yelled. Tauros mooed in agreement and raised its legs to stomp the ground. However, before it could even do the attack, Arcanine burst out of the ground at super speed right underneath Tauros. The wild bull Pokemon was sent flying and landed a short distance away. "Wow! That's so fast!" Ash exclaimed in surprise. "I figured you would try something like Earthquake, Ash," Gary called from across the court. "I've trained my Arcanine to be able to dig extremely fast through the ground, so that can't happen. We don't dig holes to hide in, just attack." "I can't let Gary get one step ahead of me," Ash thought. "I've got to be able to take him by surprise, but how?" "Use Takedown, Arcanine," Gary shouted. "Use your Takedown, as well, Tauros," Ash countered. Both Pokemon reared their heads back for speed and shot towards each other for a head-on collision. They continued to run towards each other, and it looked like each would take serious damage, but Gary called out another surprise attack. "Use Flamethrower, Arcanine," Gary yelled. Ash and Tauros's eyes widened as Arcanine opened its mouth and blew forth a stream of fire just before they collided. The fire engulfed Tauros, which completely threw it off balance. Arcanine then rammed into it, but Tauros grimaced and held firm despite the difficulty. It then locked its horns against Arcanine's legs. "Heh. That's a pretty tough Tauros if it can stand its ground after being hit by Arcanine," Gary praised. He then called, "Arcanine. Flare Blitz." "Not this time. Send Arcanine flying, Tauros," Ash hollered. Tauros strained as it picked up Arcanine's large body. It could feel Arcanine's body heating up and knew it had to be quick. It gave a mighty heave before lifting the dog-like Pokemon over its head and tossing it backwards. Arcanine soared through the air and landed with loud thud on the ground. "Not bad, Ash," Gary smirked as Arcanine got up off of the court ground. "I think I can take advantage of having Tauros charge against Arcanine like that. Gary doesn't know Tauros knows a certain move, so we can catch him off guard," Ash thought. Before calling out, "Tauros. Use Takedown." Tauros gave a loud moo and charged towards Arcanine with everything it had. "That again, huh? Well, Arcanine, let's turn up the heat. Overpower that Tauros with Flare Blitz," Gary shouted. Arcanine gave a howl before it became enveloped towards Tauros and charged towards it in full force. Both Pokémon were getting closer to each other and about to collide once more. Gary thought he had the match until Ash called out his next move. Tauros, double team. Ash yelled. Double team? Gary questioned. He didn't know a Tauros could learn that, and there were so many. Sure enough, Tauros split into several copies of itself just before it reached Arcanine. The dog-like Pokémon gave a cry of surprise at being thrown off like that. Many copies went right past it as it went through a few itself. It then stopped Flare Blitz and frantically looked around for the real Tauros. Awesome, Tauros. Use Earthquake and then take down. Ash called. A few copies of the Tauros then stamped the ground, which caused it to begin shaking repeatedly. Because it was shaking so badly, it was hard for Arcanine to focus on which one was the real one, which is what Ash wanted. Now use takedown. Ash hollered. Use flamethrower on all of the copies. Gary cried. All the Tauros sped towards Arcanine as it blew flamethrowers on as many Tauros as it could. It wasn't able to find the real Tauros, though, as the wild bull Pokémon crashed into it a second later, sending it flying backwards and into the air. Go after it, Tauros! Ash yelled. Tauros ran after Arcanine while it was in the air and leaped up as well to smash it with its horns. Use flamethrower again, Arcanine! Gary yelled. Arcanine managed to get the flamethrower out just before Tauros could reach it. The wild bull Pokémon was engulfed in flames but still pushed onward. It then collided with Arcanine in the air and knocked it towards the ground before falling itself. Ash and Gary looked on with worry as both of their Pokémon fell to the ground with a resounding thud. Tauros and Arcanine grit their teeth as they struggled to stand, but to no avail. They had taken too much damage and fell to the ground in defeat. It was a double knockout. Both trainers stood at opposite ends of the court with a small smile on their faces. So the match had ended in a tie. Unlike with Ash's battle with Paul a while back, which had also ended in a tie, Gary and Ash had seemed to gain a newfound respect for each other from the tie. It was almost as if they weren't as bad as they made each other out to be. Ash had been wanting to beat Gary for as long as he could remember, but ever since they had been on better terms with each other, Ash was just happy to battle him in general, and Ash was sure Gary felt the same. Ash and Pikachu went over to Tauros while Gary went over to Arcanine. Ash then knelt down next to Tauros and rubbed it on its side. Thanks a lot, Tauros. You battled really hard. I'm proud of you, Ash told it. Tauros gave a light moo before sighing deeply. Ash looked over and saw Gary doing the same for his Arcanine. Ash couldn't help but smile at that. It seemed that even despite his arrogance, Gary really did love his Pokémon and took care of them as much as Ash. He really was a good Pokémon trainer. So that's that, Delia said with a small smile. A fun match between two great trainers from Pallet Town. Ash then returned Tauros to its Pokeball while Gary returned Arcanine. Gary then stood up and walked over to Ash before holding out his hand. You did a great job, Ash. You've definitely become a much stronger trainer since I last saw you. I can't believe I used to think you wouldn't make it this far. You really proved me wrong. I had fun battling you, Gary said. Wow. Thanks a lot, Gary. I had fun battling you, too, Ash said as he took Gary's hand and was pulled to his feet. Expect a few more challenges from me while we are staying in Pallet Town. I want to warm up for the Pokemon League as much as I can by battling worthy trainers, Gary smirked. Ash felt his grin grow much wider once Gary said that. His old rival considered him a worthy Pokemon trainer. Their friends then gathered around them to congratulate both on a well-fought battle. Red and Blue looked on as they continued to reminiscence. It really was like they were looking at younger versions of themselves in Ash and Gary. Those two started off as bitter rivals but would probably be best friends in the coming years, just like they were. It had been a couple of days since Gary and Ash had their battle. They group had spent the last couple of days in Viridian City at the hospital once they learned Riley would be discharged fairly soon. They had left Viridian City that morning and had just arrived back in Pallet Town using the adults' various flying Pokemon, and Yellow returned to her Viridian City home. Despite last time coming here briefly when his mom had been kidnapped, Ash took in a deep breath of the clean Pallet Town air before letting out a smile. It truly was good to be home. They had landed in front of Professor Oak's lab, and Ash turned to his friends with a wide smile on his face. "Hey guys. I'll race you to Professor Oak's backyard," Ash yelled in enthusiastically as he took off running towards the front door. "Hey. No fair," Misty yelled as they ran after him. As they ran, Serena couldn't help but smile about how happy Ash seemed to finally be home. It was true he couldn't return to his own house at the moment, but it would be repaired in due time. He just seemed satisfied that he was finally here. He could be with his friends and Pokemon. As Ash quickly opened the door and bolted inside, he nearly collided with Professor Oak, who was coming to greet them all at the door. Ash had to quickly spin away to avoid the Pokemon professor and ended up losing his balance and falling on the floor, sending Pikachu flying off his shoulder. "Oh. Ash. You almost gave me a heart attack," Professor Oak cried as he stumbled, as well. "Ehehehe. Sorry, Professor," Ash mumbled as he rubbed the back of his head. Everyone else had arrived at the door by then and sighed when they saw Ash on the floor and Professor Oak holding his hand over his chest and panting heavily. Same old, eager Ash. Despite maturing greatly since he started his journey, it still seemed his eagerness at some things would never go away. Serena went over and helped Ash to his feet while Gary and Blue went over to Professor Oak and steadied him. Ash quickly reached into his backpack and checked the Pokemon egg to make sure it wasn't damaged in his fall. Thankfully, it wasn't. Once again. "Sorry, Professor. I was just really excited about being back home and see my Pokemon. I didn't really look to see where I was going," Ash repeated. "Oh, I suppose that's quite all right, Ash," Professor Oak responded. It was then he noticed the Pokemon egg in Ash's hands. "By the way, where did you get that Pokemon egg at?" "Oh. Right." Ash exclaimed as his eyes lit up. He had been meaning to show this egg to Professor Oak for quite some time but never got around to it. "I received this egg on Cinnabar Island from some scientists. They wouldn't tell me what was inside of it." "Young man. Would it be too much trouble if you allowed me to research that egg for a while?" Professor Oak asked. "Not at all. I had been meaning to show it to you." Ash smiled as he handed the toy-like designed egg over to the Pokemon professor. "Ah! Wonderful!" Professor Oak cried in delight as he took the egg from Ash. He then called over his shoulder, "Daisy. Come here. We have a new Pokemon egg to research." "Coming," called an alluring voice. All eyes turned to the doorway to see a teenage girl around 18 years old enter the room. She was Gary Oak's older sister and daughter of Blue Oak. Daisy had long hair that reached slightly down her back in the same dark brown color as Blue and Gary. She was a very intelligent girl whom had always been interested in researching Pokemon instead of battling. She had recently started helping out her grandpa in his research lab within the past year. It was fortunate that Gary was away on his Pokemon journey rather than still living at his house. Professor Oak and Blue were always away, so it was up to Daisy to care for Gary since their mom passed away a while back. As Daisy came forward, Ash couldn't help but feel his cheeks tinge pink a little. Despite never really thinking about girls as beautiful before, Daisy had still always managed to catch Ash's eye. She had always been so nice to him when he was growing up, unlike her brother who was usually a jerk. They were almost complete opposites. Despite his tingling cheeks, Ash was quickly reminded of Serena standing right next to him. He noticed Serena's expression darken slightly and quickly changed his face to look as neutral as possible. He had a girlfriend now and couldn't see another girl like that. Brock, on the other hand. "Oh my!" Brock suddenly exclaimed, causing those nearest to him to jump. He then ran forward and bent down on one knee in front of Daisy. "Daisy, my dearest. Such a lovely name. Of course, you are even more beautiful than the name or flower itself. Run away with me and, you." Kabuto had appeared from Brock's pokeball and stabbed him in the back with one of its sharp claws. Brock groaned and fell onto the ground in pain as Misty came over and smiled at Kabuto. She then picked up Brock by his ear and dragged him off. "A better idea would be my hand running away with your ear," Misty muttered. Yes, she could feel herself forming a great kinship with Kabuto. Brock was extremely embarrassed. How was he supposed to remain loyal to Susie if he would act like this around every pretty girl? He just did it in front of everyone. On top of that, he had to control himself. He saw everyone, particularly Gary, Blue, and Professor Oak with frowns on their faces. Ahem. Anyway, Professor Oak began with slight annoyance at Brock's interruption for hitting on his granddaughter. "Ash has brought us a Pokemon egg given to him on Cinnabar Island. I have never seen an egg like this before. It should prove very crucial in our research." "That sounds wonderful," Daisy agreed as she looked at the egg before turning to Ash. "Don't worry, Ash. We'll be very careful and take great care of the egg." "Thank you," Ash replied, smiling despite himself. Serena mentally frowned as she gazed at Daisy. The truth was she had always been a little jealous of the older girl. She seemed to be ahead of her in everything with looks, age, and maturity in mind and other places. Serena knew that Daisy would never be a rival of her affection for Ash due to their extreme difference in age, but still, it would be nice to have some of the things that Daisy has. Now knowing that his egg was in good hands, Ash thought he would ask the Pokemon professor properly now. "Hey Professor. I came by to see how all of my Pokemon were doing. Would you mind if I saw them? I would like to see mine, too," Serena added, turning her attention away from Daisy. "Of course. You all are free to stay as long as you want," Professor Oak replied with a smile. He knew that their Pokemon would be so excited to see their trainers. "Well, Ash, Delia and I are going to head back to Grace's house in the meantime," Red spoke up. "I think I'll stay in Pallet Town for a little while to make sure everything is taken care of. Then I'll be leaving again." Ash slowly nodded his head at the last part of his father's words. He really wanted his dad to stay permanently, but he now knew it was for a good reason. He would have to make sure to get some good quality time in with Red before he left. "Take care, dear. You kids be home before dark," Grace called to Serena and the others as they left, leaving Daisy, Professor Oak, Blue, and Rose. "So Blue, tell me what you've been up to. We really haven't had a chance to have a conversation since you came back with all that's happened," Rose said while giving Blue a light punch to the shoulder. Pesky woman," Blue mumbled before heading off into another part of the lab with Rose following him. Professor Oak then turned back to the remaining children and smiled down at them. "While you are here, I will be happy to upgrade all of you Pokédexes, as well," he spoke, which caused the others to look with interest. "Upgrade?" Serena questioned. "Yes," Daisy affirmed. "You see, there have been new Pokemon not native to Kanto recently that weren't in your old Pokédexes. Once we update them, they will have these Pokemon in them as well as updates of the older Pokemon. That sounds great. Thank you. Ash smiled as he and Serena handed Professor Oak their Pokédexes. Upon receiving them, Professor Oak turned to Leaf and Gary, especially Leaf's crestfallen look. Don't worry, you two. You will each be given a brand new Pokédex to replace your destroyed ones. Fortunately, I keep records of all the Pokemon trainers have recorded on their Pokédexes in a main computer. You will still have data on all the Pokemon you have encountered so far. Really? Leaf exclaimed joyfully. The two were very happy upon hearing that, particularly Leaf. She had worked incredibly hard to fill up her Pokédex with all the Pokemon she had encountered and captured. She was heartbroken at the thought of possibly having to start her goal over, but thanks to Professor Oak, she would be able to continue where she left off. Ash and the others were just about to head out back when Professor Oak stopped him. Hold on, Ash. One more thing. Professor Oak called, reaching into his coat pocket and withdrawing a Pokeball from it. Ash instantly knew which one it was, and he let out a sigh. He realized he hadn't seen this Pokemon at all since the incident a short while back. Cubone couldn't help but look down in shame upon seeing Aerodactyl's Pokeball. It still remembered how the disaster on Cinnabar Island was mostly its fault. Aerodactyl's Pokeball, Ash muttered. It is, Professor Oak confirmed as he handed the Pokeball to Ash. I never opened it except to feed it as you instructed me to. Please be very careful with it. I will, Ash responded as he took the Pokeball from Professor Oak's hands. He then headed out back with Serena, Brock, Misty, Gary, and Leaf following him. He knew he would have to face this sooner or later. He only hoped a disaster wouldn't happen like last time when he opened the Pokeball. He just had to let Aerodactyl know that he and his friends could be trusted. As Ash stepped out back, he and the others looked around in awe at how large Professor Oak's backyard really was. With the exception of Brock and Misty, they had been back here several times before, but it still blew them away every time at how this area served as the storage for all Pokemon that weren't traveling with their trainers at the moment. They couldn't even see the end of it. Gary and Leaf went off to see their Pokemon while Ash and Serena released all of their Pokemon with them, save Aerodactyl. Ash then called at the top of his lungs. Hey, guys. Guess who's back? A few seconds later all of Ash's Pokemon were running up to him from various parts of Professor Oak's backyard. Serena's Pokemon were coming as well because they knew that if Ash was here, it was likely Serena was, too. It wasn't long before all the Pokemon reached Ash and Serena and tackled them to ground with Pikachu and Cubone joining in. Misty and Brock watched with a smile on their face as they saw the affection the Pokemon were giving their trainers. Ha 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 ha. Thanks, guys. It's good to see all of you, too. Ash laughed as their Pokemon got off him and Serena. Well, the exception was Omenet, who was clinging to Serena's leg. Ash stared at the Pokemon that were at lab and smiled at each of them. Krabby, Mook, Hitmonchan, Pidgeotto, Haunter, and, where was Dratini? Ash looked over the other Pokemon and saw Dratini sitting quietly behind them as it stared up at Ash. Ash went over to Dratini and scratched it behind the ears. Hey there, Dratini. It's been a while. How have you been? Dratini noticeably flinched under Ash's touch but relaxed at how relaxing it felt. It then crawled over and nuzzled its face on Ash's leg. Pikachu and Cubone came over to say hi to the timid Dratini as well, to which it warily looked at them before nodding its head back. Now that Ash had greeted all of his Pokemon, he stared warily at Aerodactyl's Pokeball to wonder if he should open it or not. He looked back at his girlfriend and friends as he saw them slowly nod their heads. He needed to do this. Ash gave a nod to all of his Pokemon to be ready for anything. The last thing they wanted was a repeat of what happened on Cinnabar Island. Ash took a deep breath before muttering. Okay, Aerodactyl. Come on out. He then pressed the button on the Pokeball as the white form of energy came forth from the Pokeball. Gary and Leaf had wandered over by now and stared on, as well. They had never seen a living Aerodactyl before, so this would be quite interesting. Aerodactyl soon took shape before stretching its wings out and letting out a loud cry. It wasn't a particularly hostile cry, but Ash and the other instantly grew wary upon hearing it. Dratini instantly darted behind all of Ash's Pokemon upon seeing the prehistoric Pokemon. Just take it nice and easy. Aerodactyl finished stretching its wings and looked around at all of the people and Pokemon surrounding it. While it didn't feel threatened by their appearances, there was no denying the weariness in their eyes, which made Aerodactyl extremely uncomfortable. It then saw Ash walking towards it with Pikachu and a firm gaze on his face. Yes, this was the boy whom it had first met and was captured by. Aerodactyl, how are you feeling? Ash asked it with a friendly tone despite the tension. Aerodactyl cocked its head in curiosity at Ash but otherwise didn't respond. It didn't quite know what to make of this situation. It also recalled the events on Cinnabar Island and didn't know how to answer. Seeing that it hadn't attacked, Ash continued. I'm really sorry about all that happened on Cinnabar Island. I think we all got off on the wrong foot. You see, what happened at the lab was a freak accident, and it probably really upset you. The truth is, we aren't out to hurt you. I just want to be your friend. Aerodactyl cried softly in response. So this boy wanted to be friends with it? Come to think of it, before it was hurt, they seemed to be getting along pretty well. I know you are weary with all of your surroundings, and it probably scares you after awakening so soon, Ash continued, but I want to help you and be your friend. I think we can make a great team. Will you give me a second chance? Aerodactyl stared at the raven-haired boy before looking once more at all the other people and Pokemon surrounding it. Despite Ash's friendly tone, it knew that these others didn't look as inviting and would probably attack it should it go wild again. The truth was, Aerodactyl didn't enjoy causing others pain, it just felt really threatened back at the lab. And its first instinct was protection. Not to mention it had just awoken and wasn't thinking rationally, which caused it to be very hostile and wild. Upon having time to adjust and cool down, it was finally thinking clearly. Maybe everything wasn't out to get it. Maybe it really could be friends with this kid and the others. They did deserve a fair chance, after all. Aerodactyl muttered as it took a few steps forward as a test to see if Ash would get scared or attack. To its great surprise, he didn't. He remained standing there with the same serious yet inviting expression. This kid really did want to be its friend. They really could put the past behind them. Aerodactyl's confused look finally turned into a genuine smile. Ash smiled back to it while everyone else let out a nervous chuckle. An Aerodactyl with a friendly smile still seemed really out of place. That's great, Aerodactyl. Thank you. Ash cried before grinning back and giving it a thumbs up. Just to make it official, welcome to the team. Pikachu. The yellow rodent added. Aerodactyl cried happily before lunging forward at Ash with its jaws wide open. Everyone else instantly screamed in horror and got an alarmed look on their face at seeing Aerodactyl go for Ash. Their look of horror then turned to confusion as they saw Aerodactyl licking Ash with its long tongue. Well, it certainly wasn't eating him or snapping his neck, at least. Ha 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 ha. Cut it out. Ash laughed as Aerodactyl continued to lick him. Gary watched the display in wonder. It seemed he had really misjudged Ash as a Pokemon trainer. Ever since Gary had given him a chance, Ash had proved him wrong time and time again. First, he was able to rescue the Sylph Company. Then, he was able to defeat the leader of Team Rocket in a Pokemon battle and save his mom. Ash tied with him in a Pokemon battle, and now, he successfully tamed an Aerodactyl, which was said to be one of the most ferocious Pokemon of the past. It truly was impressive. His gaze then happened to wander to the sky, and he raised his eyebrows. "Hey, guys. Look. What's that up there?" he asked as he pointed. Everyone followed Gary's gaze, and got confused looks as well when they saw the object getting closer. It was clearly a Pokemon, but what? Wait a second, a Dragonite? Sure enough, the Pokemon that was heading towards them deliberately was the very rare Pokemon, Dragonite. It certainly didn't look like Reds, from what the group could tell. So what on earth would one want with them? It seemed to be carrying a brown bag of some sort. As Dragonite landed, everyone watched in confusion as it pointed to Ash, Gary, and Serena and motioned them over to it. Giving everyone else and their Pokemon a look of uneasiness, the three made their way over to the fully evolved dragon type. Professor Oak and Daisy had heard the commotion from inside the lab and ran outside to see what it was about. Upon seeing a Dragonite, they let out a gasp of surprise. This certainly was an unusual sight. The Dragonite in question didn't look either hostile or friendly. It just looked completely neutral once Ash, Serena, and Gary reached it. The Dragonite then reached into its brown pouch before withdrawing 3 letters. It then handed each of them to Gary, Ash, and Serena before waiting expectantly. "It's a letter?" Ash questioned as he looked up at the Dragonite, receiving a nod from it. The others and their Pokemon crowded around the trio as they went to get a closer look at the letters they had each received. They were brown in color and looked simple enough, with a Pokeball symbol in the middle. Something about the texture felt off, though. Ash was the first who attempted to open the letter. To his great surprise, he noticed there wasn't a place to tear it open. Ash then jumped as a blue light suddenly shone through the Pokeball symbol on the letter and an image of a woman dressed in brown servant's outfit appeared. Only her face was visible due to how much she was covered. Despite this, she looked somewhat familiar to everyone. "Wow. She's really small but really pretty," Brock commented. "Well, you certainly got over my sister quickly," Gary muttered with disdain. It was then the hologram of the woman bowed and began to speak. "Greetings, Pokemon trainers. I bear an invitation. You have been chosen to join a select group of Pokemon trainers at a special gathering. It will be hosted by my master, the world's greatest Pokemon trainer, at his palace on New Island. A chartered ferry will leave from Old Shore Wharf to take you to the island tomorrow afternoon. Only trainers who present this invitation will be admitted. If you decide to attend, you must decide at once. 1 guest per member is welcome. My master awaits you." With one last bow, the hologram of the woman faded to leave nothing but the envelope. "Is there a rewind button?" Brock asked hopefully. He didn't know why, but there was just something about this woman that was driving him crazy. Only 3 women could do that every time: Nurse Joy, Officer Jenny, and Susie. This was rather strange. Upon seeing the deadpan looks everyone else was giving him, Brock closed his mouth. "So what do you guys think? Should we go?" "The hologram said we could bring a guest if we want," Ash suggested. "This is certainly quite odd," Professor Oak noted as he folded his arms. "A meeting with the strongest Pokemon trainer in the world? The whole format of this seems quite off to me. You should all consult with your parents before deciding to go." "But Gramps, the letter said we have to respond immediately. If we go ask our parents, it will be too late," Gary argued. "I understand, Gary. I'm just warning you all of the strangeness of this," Professor Oak said with a sigh. "Ultimately, it's up to you, but I'm not responsible for how all of your parents take this." At least inform them of the situation as soon as you decide. So are we going, guys? Ash asked. We each can bring a guest, so we will all get to go. I'll choose Brock for my guest. I'll bring Misty for my guest, Serena said. I'll bring Leaf with me, Gary stated next. Then it's settled. Ash exclaimed with a grin as he quickly pulled a note out of the envelope and checked yes before handing it to Dragonite. Serena and Gary did the same. The Dragonite stuffed the envelopes back into the brown bag it was carrying and nodded to the group. It then took flight and flew off quickly towards another destination. It wasn't long until it was out of sight. I guess we should go ahead and tell everyone, Ash suggested. I bet they will be excited for us and say yes. No. Blue asserted with a frown. He and the other adults were all in front of their children and looked pretty firm with their decision. No? What do you mean no? Gary asked somewhat angrily. I mean we all just recovered from dealing with a life-threatening situation with Team Rocket. We don't want you all running off to do something dangerous again. Blue shouted. Back. Dangerous? How would this be dangerous? Ash inquired in a confused tone. The weather reports say there is a storm brewing very quickly, Delia said. They say it is turning into the worst storm they have seen in quite a while. The worst part was its origin seemed to be New Island where your meeting is supposed to be. It will be here by tomorrow. A storm doesn't scare me, Mom. Serena and I have been lost in a snowstorm before, and we turned out fine in the end, Ash replied. You two were once lost in a snowstorm. Grace gasped in fright. Ash immediately bit his tongue at what he had said. He and Serena never told their parents about that incident. He turned and saw Serena looking at him with a slight frown. This wasn't helping their situation at all. Even if there is a storm, we'll be fine because there is a ferry that is taking us there. This is a rare opportunity that we are going to meet the strongest trainer in the world. Gary tried. World's strongest Pokemon trainer? Red asked with questioning look on his face. He seriously doubted that. That's right. The trainer may want to challenge us to a match, or just give us words of encouragement and what it means to be a Pokemon master, Ash said. So you don't even know what you will be doing there? Grace asked with her hands on her hips. Well, no, Serena finished lamely. Blue let out an exasperated sigh. I don't know. This whole thing seems really fishy to me. Something isn't right about this ordeal. We'll be really careful. We promise, Ash said. We'll get to the island safely because of the ferry. The adults all looked warily at each other as if trying to decide what to do. They knew that their kids were trying to be great Pokemon trainers, and if this invitation was real, it would undoubtedly be very educational and helpful. Red was the most skeptical out of all of them of the authenticity of the claim. He did see the reason in the kid's logic, though. I don't believe this is the world's strongest Pokemon trainer in the world we're talking about, but maybe this could be good for you, Red decided. You're going to let them go, Red? Delia asked as she turned to her husband. I can't say I'm thrilled about this letter, but they remind me a lot of ourselves when we were young, and those things we did were a lot more dangerous than a gathering for a trainer convention, Red said with a smile. Well, I can't argue with that, Delia replied as she turned towards Ash to give him worried expression. If you promise to be safe, Ash, Red and I will let you go. I promise. Thanks, Ash said. I'm with Ash's parents on this. If you promise to be safe, I will let you go, as well. Don't do anything too rash, Grace said with a slightly stern look. I promise, to. Thanks, Mom, Serena replied. Dad? Gary asked as he looked up expectantly at Blue. Blue gazed back down at his son before giving an exasperated sigh. All right, fine. Do what you want. Just come home in one piece. I suppose because everyone else said yes, I would hate to be the bad guy, so you can go, as well, Rose said to her daughter. Great. Thanks, Mom. Leaf said cheerfully. All right, everyone. Are you ready to meet the world's best Pokemon trainer? Ash asked as they all put their hands inside a circle. Right. They all responded enthusiastically. Then let's do it. Ash cheered as they all broke away. It was now the next day, and the group had departed for Old Shore Wharf. It had been a rather hard choice for the group to decide which Pokemon they were going to bring with them to the gathering. After much thought, Ash was bringing along Pikachu, Charizard, Wartortle, Bulbasaur, Dratini, and Pidgeotto. The small dragon Pokemon was initially shy, but Ash's words were enough to encourage it to go with him. Serena was bringing along Charla, Nidorina, Jigglypuff, Hitmonlee, Scyther, and Eevee. Luckily, it wasn't going to be a long walk at all as it was only a few miles south of Pallet Town. This would be the area besides Fuchsia City or Vermilion City where people would go to get to Cinnabar Island or other regions. Because of this, it had only taken them a few hours to get there. It had only been light rain when the group had left Pallet Town, but by the time they reached the wharf, the rain was pouring and the wind was blowing very quickly. Massive waves were crashing against the coastline. Not even their umbrellas were helping anymore. They quickly reached the building where the ferry was docked and went inside, completely drenched. Oh, I'm soaked, Serena moaned as she, Misty, and Leaf wringed out their clothes. I can't believe how fast the storm came up. This is crazy. Brock said as he shook his face in an effort to get the water out of his thick hair, effectively spraying the girls again. Upon seeing their glares, he gave a sheepish grin. Pkaa, Pikachu muttered miserably as its cheeks sparked from being wet. Cubone was shivering violently at being so wet. Serena saw this and got out a towel from her backpack before beginning to dry Cubone off. Despite trying to toughen up lately, it still wasn't fully ready yet. It was then the group took a good look around the building and were surprised to find so many people here. They were expecting maybe a couple dozen other trainers here, but this place was packed. Their number of Pokemon trainers had to be well into the several hundreds. It didn't look like this gathering was as exclusive as they once thought. Despite the place being full of trainers, the group noticed that the biggest cluster was gathered in a small semicircle where the ferry was supposed to leave out. There was clearly a lot of commotion and some kind of conflict going on over there. Deciding to see what it was, the group headed in that direction and could hear bits and pieces of what was being said. What do you mean the ferry to New Island has been cancelled? One trainer exclaimed. I have to get to New Island for the Pokemon Trainers Convention. It's just a little rain. Another one shouted. The group froze upon hearing that. The ferry had been cancelled. Why? None of you trainers clearly know the danger of this storm. It's more than just a little rain, and Officer Jenny rebutted. It's just too dangerous. So what? I've been in worse storms than this. Another trainer argued. You haven't even begun to see how bad this storm is going to get. Our harbor manager believes that this could be one of the worst storms ever. Officer Jenny stated as he turned to a lady with long blue hair. Listen to me, Pokemon trainers. The woman spoke with an accent. The prophets are predicting the return of the winds of rage. For years I have prayed that mankind would never witness that storm again. But isn't that just a legend? Officer Jenny asked. Several of the trainers looked a little confused, as well. Surely this wasn't really happening. The ancient writings tell that the storm wiped out everyone but just a few Pokemon. In their sorrow, it is said that water from the Pokemon's tears were able to restore the lives lost in the storm, but there are no Pokemon tears today. There are just waters which no one can survive, the woman explained. That's why your ferry to New Island has been cancelled. Officer Jenny finished, addressing the trainers again. By now, the group had managed to find their way into the crowd and had heard most of what was being said. If the ferry was cancelled, what were they supposed to do now, and what was all this talk about a major storm happening now? So what? A rather cold and familiar voice spoke up from the crowd. Our Pokemon can just take us there themselves. All eyes turned to the person who had spoken in the crowd. Upon seeing who it was, the group let out a small gasp of surprise. It was Paul. He was actually here, too. It was the cold boy everyone had an unpleasant experience with. The only person among the group who hadn't met him yet was Gary Oak. I warn you, this storm is savage. You will never make it, the harbor manager said firmly. Besides, if your Pokemon got hurt, you would be out of luck because the Pokemon Center of this area has been closed down. Officer Jenny stated. It's been closed down? Why? Ash asked. It's because the Nurse Joy inside of the center has mysteriously disappeared. No one knows where she is. Officer Jenny replied, looking directly at him. Nurse Joy's disappeared. Brock asked sullenly. Say it isn't so. The group ignored that comment as they thought of what to do next. By now, the crowd had begun to disperse in various areas around the building. Some stayed to talk. Others seemed to sit down on nearby chairs to see if they could wade the storm out. Others seemed to just simply leave altogether, probably to go home. Great. So that's it then, Ash muttered in defeat. I was so excited about meeting the best Pokemon trainer in the world, too. I know. I was, too, Ash, Serena said soothingly as she rubbed his back. Wait. What's Paul doing? Misty asked in confusion as she pointed at him. The group looked and sure enough, Paul was heading out onto the dock. Was he actually going to try to board the ferry? Ash found himself running towards Paul before he even knew what he was doing. He didn't know why he was going after the cold boy who was his complete opposite. Most of the time, they just tried to avoid each other, but fate kept them meeting when they least expected it. Paul. What are you doing? Ash called out as he came up behind the purple-haired boy, the rest of the group following him. Paul slowly turned around and gave a glare upon seeing who it was. You've got to be kidding me. You're here. Paul said in disgust. Yeah, I'm here, and I'll have you know I got all 8 badges. Ash declared as he showed Paul the inside of his jacket. Paul merely rolled his eyes in response. So what? He muttered as he turned around to head back to the dock. What are you doing, anyway, Paul? Serena asked this time. I already said what I was going to do. Since the ferry's been cancelled, my Pokemon are taking me to New Island, Paul replied without stopping. With that, he was out the door. Who was that? Gary asked. That's Paul. He and Ash don't like each other, Serena answered with a frown. He isn't the friendliest person you'll ever meet. Forget about Paul. Let him go and get hurt if he wants, Misty said in disdain. I agree, Ash, Brock replied as he placed his hand on his friend's shoulder. We should just head back to Pallet Town. Ash, however, wasn't going to back down too easily. He was determined to be a Pokemon master. If he turned tail and ran at the first sign of trouble, what kind of trainer would he be? As he stated before, he believed he had been in worse situations than this. The world's greatest Pokemon master is waiting for me on New Island, Ash declared with determination. Let's use our Pokemon to cross the ocean. Ash, are you crazy? Have you not seen those waves? Our Pokemon aren't strong enough to carry us across. Misty exclaimed. Besides, we promised your parents that we would be safe. Crossing the ocean like that is anything but safe, Brock warned. This is just one more obstacle I need to conquer to become a Pokemon Master, Ash declared. Who's with me? I am, Serena answered immediately. There was no way she was going to let her boyfriend cross the ocean by himself. Furthermore, the world's greatest Pokemon trainer was waiting for her, as well. Thanks, Serena, Ash replied with a smile. I knew I could count on you. Count me in, too, Ash, Gary spoke up. I feel the same way you do. We can't let a storm stop us. If you guys are going, so am I, Leaf said next. Brock and Misty stared at the 4 Pallet Town natives and sighed. Those 4 had grown up together and always seemed to be connected in everything they did. It was like anything one did, the others had to do, also. It must be part of being childhood friends. Well, someone's going to need to take care of your Pokemon while you're there, Brock said with a deep breath. I'm going, too. Oh, why do you all have to be so stubborn? Misty sighed once again before saying, count me in, too. Guys, Ash trailed. Despite the storm and raging waters, all of his friends were still going with him. He really did have the best of friends. All right. Let's go. I'm sure if all of our water Pokemon work together, we can cross the ocean. Pikachu added. It was then they hurried out to where Paul had just a few moments earlier. Once they were outside, they were immediately greeted by the harsh rain and wind, drenching them all over again. They noticed Paul had called out his Fearow in the meantime and had hopped on, preparing to take flight. Unfortunately, Officer Jenny noticed, as well, and ran past the group towards Paul. Stop right there, young man, or I'll place you under arrest. Jenny called after him. Paul said nothing in reply as his Fearow soon flapped its regal wings into the air and took off over the ocean. It was clear he wasn't going to listen and was determined to get the island. Come back here. Officer Jenny yelled again. Some trainers have no fear, the harbor manager said as she came up behind Jenny. Upon seeing Officer Jenny turn towards her, she continued. To them this is just one more challenge. They follow their hearts. That is what separates them apart, and will make them great Pokemon masters. Officer Jenny sighed as she glanced worriedly after Paul before turning to the group. She saw the looks on their faces before giving almost a pleading look. Don't tell me you're planning on going out there, as well, she said. The group said nothing in reply. They didn't want to disobey the orders of Officer Jenny, but they had to get to New Island. Upon them not replying, Officer Jenny knew their minds had been made up. It was out of her hands. Just please be safe, and don't get hurt, Officer Jenny mumbled before heading back inside. Good luck to all of you, the harbor manager added before heading inside, as well. The group then turned back to the waves. Was it just them, or did the waves become even more ferocious since they arrived at the dwarf? They couldn't let that deter them. However, there was no doubt their water Pokemon were too small to cross this by themselves, but maybe if they worked together? I think I have a solution, Gary spoke up, which caused the others to turn to him instead. We each release every water-type Pokemon we have. They can join hands or fins or whatever they have to increase their weight and resistance. Then we can each grab onto their backs and swim across that way. The group glanced back wearily towards the waves. Would combining their Pokemon's weight really increase their chances? None of them owned any exceptionally large water Pokemon. If they had enough flying types, they could fly across the ocean like Paul, but there was also the lightning. I don't see a better way myself, Ash agreed. I believe in the strength of our Pokemon. We can cross this ocean. Which water-type Pokemon does everyone have with them right now? I have Wartortle with me. I have Staryu, Starmie, Goldeen, Magikarp, and shelter. Seduc isn't really suitable for swimming, Misty said. I have a dugong, Leaf spoke up. All right. I have a Blastoise, Gary stated next. That's 8 Pokemon and 6 people, so each of us can grab onto one of our Pokemon. All right? Let's go, guys. Ash cried as he and the rest released their water Pokemon into the raging sea. Upon being released, each of the Pokemon began to get tossed around in the waves but held strong. We need you guys to hold onto each other. We're going to cross the ocean together and need as much endurance as possible against these waves. Ash called below. The Pokemon nodded their heads and joined hands and fins in an effort to stay together. It seemed to work as they were much more stable than they were before. Ash then turned to give the signal for everyone to jump down below and grab the nearest Pokemon. Pikachu and Cubone climbed into Ash and Serena's backpacks, respectively, in order to remain safer from any danger. Okay, everyone. 1, 2, 3. Ash called as he and everyone else jumped into the viscous waters. As soon as Ash made contact with the water, he almost wished he hadn't. The water was much colder than he was anticipating. His whole body submerged beneath the raging waves above, but it wasn't much better underwater, either. Because of the choppy ocean above, there were several currents underwater that were tossing Ash all over the place. He immediately began to swim towards the top as fast as he could. Once Ash broke the water's surface, he took a huge gulp of air, only for his mouth to be filled with salt water a second later from a wave that splashed into him. Ash coughed several times before he felt someone grab both of his arms and pull him forward and onto an awaiting Pokemon. Ash stopped spluttering and saw it was Serena and Gary who had reached out and grabbed at him. He gave a grateful smile, which they returned, and held on tight to his Warderdle. Serena was next to him holding onto Misty's Goldeen. Gary was on his other side holding onto his Blastoise, Leaf was holding her Dugong, Misty was holding her Starmie, and Brock was holding onto Storie. Shelter and Magikarp were free from carrying anyone. Okay, guys. Let's go. Ash cried as the Pokemon began swimming forward with the trainers holding on tightly. The group was constantly bombarded by the ferocious waves as they went along. It wasn't helping matters that the waves were growing even larger as they got farther out to sea. As if they weren't bad enough at land. Despite this, they were holding up really well and refused to let go. Each Pokemon was able to keep up with the other surprisingly well. Even Magikarp. The Scale and Bones fish Pokemon had really improved its swimming capabilities since Misty taught it. If only poor Seduc could swim better, too. It had been about 20 minutes since the group had entered the ocean, and the storm hadn't let up any since then and showed no signs of stopping. The group's Pokemon were beginning to show signs of fatigue. They normally didn't get tired from swimming so easily, but because they were constantly having to fight the waves and carry their trainers, their endurance was depleting quickly. Upon seeing this, the trainers stretched out their legs and began to kick the water in order to help them out more. These waves are horrible. Serena choked as she once again got a face full of salt water. The water was beginning to make its way into her eyes, causing them to burn terribly. She wanted to wipe her eyes but couldn't let go of Goldeen for even a second, or she would be flung into the ocean. The next wave crashed in them with enough force to wear. Serena's favorite pink hat that Ash had gotten her was blown off of her head and into the ocean. My hat! Serena cried as she made a grab for it, but missed. Don't! Ash warned as he reached over and grabbed her arm despite the danger. Serena looked back at Ash with hurt in her eyes. The same pink hat that Ash had given her on her 10th birthday was gone. She had worn it every day since then and only took it off to bathe or sleep. It was lost in the raging ocean. I know you really liked that hat because it came from me, but the hat can be replaced. You can't, Ash told her gently before giving her arm a reassuring squeeze. I care a lot more about you than the hat I gave you. Serena felt her eyes water but soon relented and held on tightly to Goldine once more. Despite her hurt that the hat was gone, Ash did have a point. I'm beginning to think this wasn't such a good idea. Misty shouted as she braced herself for another wave. We've got to keep pushing on. We've got to make it to New Island. The world's greatest Pokemon trainer is waiting there, Ash declared. Ash waited to see if any of his friends would agree with him but heard no response. He looked around and got a little discouraged that his words seemed to have no effect on anyone, but he soon saw why. Their attention was focused on something entirely different. Ash followed their gazes and his eyes widened in horror as he saw a massive wave at least 50 feet high coming straight for them. There was no way they were going to make it over that one. Ash, Serena muttered fearfully as she saw the wave coming closer. They reached over and grabbed each other's hands out of instinct of the incoming wave. Everyone gritted their teeth at what was coming. They didn't know if they were even going to survive this. Ash shut his eyes tight and prepared himself. Here it comes. Gary shouted as the wave reached them and they were flung upwards in its depths before toppling into the sea. The force of the wave broke everyone's grip on each other as they were flung in different directions outward. Misty screamed as she disappeared first into the sea, followed by Leaf, Brock, Gary, Serena, and finally Ash since he was in the very center. The unpleasant shock of falling in the water came upon Ash once again. He frantically began to swim back towards the surface before breaking through again. The only problem was there was no Pokemon to grab onto for support this time. Ash frantically looked around for signs of anyone as he was tossed around in the sea but couldn't find anyone. SS Serena. Anyone? Ash coughed. It was really hard to get any words out because every time Ash opened his mouth, it was filled with salt water. Ash squinted his eyes to see if he could spot anyone amidst the chaos, but found no traces. Ash noticed that his back felt unusually light before reaching his hand back to feel around. He gasped in terror when he felt his backpack was missing. Pikachu was inside his backpack. A growing dread began to churn inside of Ash as he realized he may be only one above the surface right now. What if all of his friends were injured or hurt in the wave or worse? What if they drowned? Tears began to make their way down Ash's face, not from the raging waters, but they were his own tears. There had to be someone out there. He and his friends had been through so much together. They couldn't have their lives ended because of some stupid storm. This couldn't be end. Ash. Ash's head instantly snapped in the direction where he heard the voice and gasped when he saw Serena struggling amongst the waves. She must have just broken surface. Ash immediately began to make his way over to Serena as fast as he could through the waters. She wasn't too far away, but the ocean was making his progress extremely slow. Salt water was bombarding him constantly and threatening to pull him under, but Ash didn't care. He was going to reach Serena at all costs. I'm coming, Serena. Ash yelled before going into another coughing fit. Ash saw her head go under the water, and he immediately took a deep breath before diving underneath to get her. He swam towards her with all of his might and grabbed onto her legs to push her further upward. Once he saw she above the water, he joined her. Ash. Serena yelled again once Ash came up. Serena. I'm so glad you're okay. Ash exclaimed as he gave her tight embrace, which Serena returned despite her spluttering. Where is everyone? Serena cried as she and Ash held each other for support. I don't know. I can't see anyone because of all of these waves. Ash replied. What if we are the only ones who survived this? Serena cried again. We can't be. I'm sure our water Pokemon are around somewhere. They aren't going to let our friends drown, Ash assured. Just as he said that, he looked around and saw Leaf and Gary emerge from the waters with their dugong and blastoise, respectively. They were coughing up a fit like Ash and Serena but appeared okay. Warderdle and Goldine emerged from the waters next. Upon seeing the two, they immediately swam towards them so they were able to grab hold of them. At least now, Ash and Serena didn't have to worry about going under. They noticed Leaf had lost her white hat as well in the ensuing chaos, but that didn't matter. At least, she and Gary were safe. Brock came up next with Storie, Starmie, and Shelder. The three Pokémon seemed to be supporting him because he looked almost ready to pass out. Ash and Serena's eyes lit up with alarm when they saw him with two backpacks draped over his arms. They were the ones that had Pikachu and Cubone. They tiredly joined the group before stopping in the raging seas. "Guys, you're all okay?" Ash cried with joy as Brock handed their backpacks back to them. Ash and Serena sighed with relief when Pikachu and Cubone poked their heads out of their respective backpacks and smiled at them. It truly was a miracle they were okay and had managed to stay in their backpacks within the chaos. "Not all of us," Brock panted. "I can't find Misty anywhere. That's why it took so long for me to come up. I don't see any sign of Magikarp, either." "What?" Ash exclaimed as he frantically looked around to find any sign of the two. "She was the first to fall in out of all of us," Leaf said worriedly. "You don't think she—" "There's no way," Ash interrupted. "Misty is training to be a master of water-type Pokémon and is a great swimmer. There is no way she would go like this." "How are we supposed to look for her?" Serena asked. "If we have any of our Pokémon look underwater, we are going to drown in these waves." Ash bit his lip as he thought of that. How were they going to search for Misty? He looked back towards the waters worriedly as they waited for her to come up. She just had to make it out of this alive. She just had to. Sure, he and Misty argued and fought quite often, but she was the first new friend he made on their journey. He wouldn't accept one of his friends dying because of his decision to brave the waves. "You guys stay up here. I'm going to search for Misty on Warderdle," he told them. "You can't, Ash," Serena warned. "You could drown in those waves even if you do have a water Pokémon with you. Besides, we need to find a way to call for help," Gary added. "There is no way we are strong enough to make it through the storm now that we are missing a person. We just have to believe in Misty's will to live." Ash gritted his teeth. He hated to admit it, but his friends were right. They wanted to find Misty, too, but logic was telling them otherwise. This was a ferocious storm that already almost killed them once. They may not make it a second time. The situation was looking pretty grim for the group. Meanwhile, Misty was steadily floating towards the bottom of the ocean. The huge impact from the water had knocked her unconscious. Magikarp had seen its master falling and was frantically paddling after her. It hated the fact that it was a horrible swimmer. Even if it had learned the basics and was no longer splashing, it still had a ways to go. Magikarp saw Misty finally open her eyes and noticeably gasped despite being underwater when she saw Magikarp coming. The poor fish Pokémon was trying its hardest despite making very little progress. Misty regained her senses and began swimming towards Magikarp before grabbing onto it and giving a signal to start swimming upward. The fish Pokémon nodded its head and began flailing around in an effort to break the surface. They were so far away, and Misty's weight was pulling it down, though. Magikarp wished it wasn't so weak. Misty had done so much for it in the past couple of months by teaching it swim and loving it despite it being so pathetic. Now, when its trainer was needing it most, it was unable to return the favor. It glanced out of the corner of its eyes and saw Misty was losing air fast. She began having a strained expression on her face as her lungs desperately began screaming for oxygen. Magikarp's eyes widened when it saw the peril Misty was in. If it didn't get her to the surface soon, she would drown, and it would be all its fault. It couldn't let that happen. It had to save Misty. These waves be darned. It had to save her. It just needed to be more powerful. Misty looked down at Magikarp and felt bad for how much her Pokémon was struggling to save her. It was a small fish, and she never felt she truly appreciated the fact for the Pokémon it was. She had taught it how to swim better and loved it like her other Pokémon, but deep down Misty still believed Magikarp to be pretty dopey. Now, it was being anything but that, and even trying to save her life. If only it wasn't the end of her life when she finally realized that her last bit of oxygen was escaping her and she was beginning to black out. It was at that moment that Magikarp began glowing white. I don't understand how we are going to get out of this. Leaf choked as the group looked around for any sign of a boat or ship. They knew that was foolish because there would be nothing of the sort out in a storm like this, but there were no other options. Never give up until the end, Ash assured her. There has to be a way out of this. I don't think your little motto is going to get us out of this one, Ash. There's no way our Pokémon can take this storm. The only way we would be able to make it is if we had a really large flying or water-type Pokémon. Gary shouted. We can't give up. Ash yelled. There has to be something. You're so naive. Gary retorted. You think that just because you say some stupid saying that it will get you out of every situation, but the world doesn't work like that. So you're saying we should just give up? Ash growled, getting fired up. No. I'm saying we need to think logically about something we can do instead of waiting for something to happen. Our Pokémon can't fight these waves. Gary fired back. Serena, Leaf, and Brock watched worriedly from the side. Misty was missing, and Gary and Ash seemed to be starting a fight. It had been a while since they've had one like this. But it certainly wasn't going to help the situation. Please stop fighting, guys, Serena said, trying to play peacemaker between the two. We can't fight. We need to work together. What do you suggest we do then? Gary snarled at her. Serena shrunk back under Gary's intense glare. It had been a while since Gary had done that. Normally, he was a decent guy around her. Don't shout at Serena. Ash roared at him. Shut up. Gary yelled back. Enough, Gary. Leaf spat as another wave washed over them. You're acting like a big jerk. We need to work together, and it isn't helping that you're making enemies out of everyone. Gary sighed once Leaf got onto him. Here he was, acting like a great big jerk again after promising Leaf he would stop doing that in the rocket cell. Why did he always have to do this and antagonize everyone who was just trying to help? Even if the situation was bad, that didn't excuse his behavior. All right. I'm sorry, Serena, and Ash, too. I just don't know what to do right now with Misty missing and our Pokémon not strong enough to take these waves, Gary said. I don't think it's going to end here for us, Gary. Something good has got to happen. We were the trainers brave enough to take these waves on no matter how bad the storm is. There is no way we are going to go like this, Ash assured. As if to answer his statement, the waters began to slosh underneath them even more than usual. The group exchanged nervous glances at this. Whatever was going on underneath them was something very large. What is this? Serena cried. Just then, a stream of water erupted next to them, sending droplets raining down all over them. When the group looked up at what had caused the spout, they screamed in horror. A Gyarados had emerged from the seas. Gyarados was a giant sea serpent-like Pokémon that always had an extremely short temper. There were always horrible stories told about these Pokémon by sailors. They truly were the terror of the seas. The Gyarados gave a mighty roar and looked down menacingly at the group. "Oh, great. Just when this couldn't get any worse," Gary cried as they all stared up worriedly at the Gyarados. Ash gritted his teeth once again as he looked at the Gyarados. They didn't think fighting it was an option. Their Pokémon were having enough trouble just staying above the water. There would be no way they could fight in the condition they were in. It was then he noticed something on the Gyarados' back. He squinted to get a better look and gasped in surprise when it was a person. Closer inspection revealed Misty. "Guys! It's Misty!" Ash yelled as he pointed to her. "Oh my gosh! How is she riding that Gyarados?" Serena exclaimed. "You don't think that's her Magikarp?" Brock said incredulously. Misty smiled and waved down at the group before pointing her Gyarados to get the group. The giant sea serpent obeyed and dove down underneath them in the water before lifting them up on its back high above the waves. Everyone was staring in complete shock at the situation that was taking place. Is this Magikarp?" Brock asked. "It sure is." Misty smiled as she patted it. "It evolved to save me. I was almost a goner." "That's so awesome!" Ash exclaimed. "Pi Pikachu!" Pikachu said from the backpack. "Yep. Getting to the island will be a breeze now. These waves are going to be no match for Gyarados." Misty smiled before pointing her index finger forward. Full speed ahead. Gyarados gave another mighty roar before powering through the waters with ease. It was true the waves were still humongous, but Gyarados was stronger. Misty was riding at the front on its back with a determined expression on her face as she stared ahead. The group couldn't help but think she looked pretty awesome controlling a Gyarados like this. They were one of the hardest Pokémon to tame. After riding for quite a while, the group saw what looked like a large castle off in the distance. Was this the new island that they were supposed to come to from the invitation? It did mention a large castle in the middle of a small island, and this certainly fit the description. Also, was it just them, or was the storm letting up quite fast? "That's weird," Ash commented as they looked up and saw the clouds thinning. "Didn't your mom say that the source of the storm was coming from New Island?" Serena asked confusedly. "If that's the case, why is it calmest here instead of worse?" "It reminds me of a hurricane," Brock spoke up. "The center of the storm has an eye where it's always calmest. Even so, this is all a little strange. I can't help but feel apprehensive," Serena said as they drew closer to the island. "It will be okay," Ash assured her as he grabbed her hand. "Everything will be fine." Serena nodded her head after Ash said that and returned his smile. She then looked back towards the rest of the group at the island and large castle ahead of them. After a long and arduous storm to go through, they had finally made it to New Island, home to supposedly the world's greatest Pokémon trainer. They had no idea what was in store for them here, but they would soon find out. Regardless, it was sure to be an experience the group would never forget. Chapter 50, Mewtwo Strikes Back Part 2. The group reached the shoreline of New Island in an oddly quiet tone. It was definitely a relief they had finally made it, but the sudden calm of the storm was very eerie and unsettling. They were expecting to be excited upon accomplishing such a feat and reaching the island where the greatest Pokémon trainer was said to reside, but after the events that happened recently, they weren't so sure anymore. Were their parents in the right to be nervous about letting them go? Gyarados lowered its body and allowed the group to climb off it before letting out a soft roar. Once they were off, Misty rubbed it on its large forehead as thanks for getting them safely across the waters. It was rather surprising that Gyarados had managed to retain its friendly personality as a Magikarp since they were known to be so ferocious. They were either really lucky or Misty was just that good of a trainer to be able to control Gyarados so quickly. Ash couldn't help but have a newfound respect for Misty after saving them all. Like this. Thanks a lot, Misty, Ash said genuinely. Don't thank me. Thank Gyarados, Misty replied with a light giggle as she continued to rub it. Of course, Ash replied as he approached the intimidating Pokemon and looking it in the eyes. He had to admit that it was pretty strange to have such a usually bad-tempered Pokemon staring back at him with warmth in its eyes. Thanks a lot, Gyarados. You saved all of us. Gyarados gave a light growl of approval before raising itself up to its full height once Misty was done rubbing it. You've been through a lot so far, Gyarados. Why don't you take a good rest? Misty suggested while returning it to her Pokeball. With that, the group turned back around and faced the large castle in front of them. If they thought it was big from far away, it was even bigger up close. They looked around for any sign of festivities or people to greet them, but didn't see anything of the sort. If it wasn't for the castle, the island would have looked like a barren wasteland. They tentatively walked to the front door and discovered it was extremely large, as well. It was brown and stretched far above them at least to almost 20 feet. They looked to see if there would be some sort of doorbell but found that was not the case. What were they supposed to do then? Simply knock? Ash decided to be the first as he reached out his hand and knocked firmly without making too much of a loud noise. The group then waited to see if anyone would answer. They doubted it would be the master trainer himself and probably one of the many servants or maids he had. After almost 30 seconds, there had still been no answer from the door. The group was beginning to wonder if they were even heard. I guess we should go ahead and enter. No one's coming, Gary said as he began walking forward to push the door open. Are you sure that's such a good idea? Serena asked from behind him. Gary turned back around to give an inquisitive glance at Serena. Well, yeah. We aren't getting anywhere by just standing here, he replied. Everyone else saw the logic to that as they all grabbed the door handle and pushed the door open. It was surprisingly light considering how big it was. With all of their strength combined, they opened it with very little effort. The castle was very dark once they entered. There were very few lanterns lining the wall giving off a small glow, and the whole room appeared to be made of nothing but rock. The room was rather small and only seemed to have a staircase that spiraled upward quite a ways. The group wasn't even able to see the top. The castle was just as eerie on the inside as it was on the outside. Pi-yi-yi-ka, Pikachu said in wonder as it looked around. Ash, suddenly I'm not so sure about this place, Serena muttered with a hint of fear in her voice. It's too late to turn back now, Serena, Gary answered instead. We've made it here so we might as well see it through. Besides, if we turn back now, we will have to go through that storm again. Since we almost died last time, that isn't something I want to experience again so soon. It'll be fine, Serena. I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you, Ash said reassuringly with a thumbs up. If it'll make you feel better, you can hold my hand. Everyone stared in surprise. Ash was actually inviting a girl to hold his hand. They knew he and Serena were a couple now, but still. Serena graciously accepted the invitation and grabbed Ash's hand for support. She then leaned in against him and immediately relaxed. She felt like such a coward right now for having a castle intimidate her like this, but as usual, Ash was the one who calmed all of her fears. She truly felt lucky to have him as a boyfriend right now. The group was just about to start ascending the staircase when they saw a lone figure coming down already. They discovered it was a young woman dressed completely in robes, with only her face showing. She was carrying a lantern in her hand for guidance against the dark room. Upon closer inspection, the group realized this was the woman who was in the hologram in the invitation. Welcome, Pokemon trainers, she greeted in a monotonous tone. I see you have made it here to the home of my master, the world's greatest Pokemon trainer. May I see your invitations as proof you were invited? Sure, Ash replied as he, Serena, and Gary pulled out their invitations and showed them to the lady. Ash then motioned to Brock, Misty, and Leaf. These three came as our guests. Understood. That is acceptable, the woman uttered before turning back around to the staircase. Please follow me. I will direct you to my master. With that, she began ascending the staircase with the group following her. As they were walking, Brock had an extremely puzzled look on his face. This lady was just as beautiful in person as she was on the hologram, but that wasn't his concern at the moment. She was so familiar despite having most of her face covered. There were only so many women in the world who had this effect on him. Very rarely did a new person do this, so she had to be someone he already knew. Then it hit him. Wait a second. Brock spoke up as he pointed his finger at the woman, alerting the rest of the group. You're the missing Nurse Joy, aren't you? Huh. The rest of the group gasped in surprise as they turned to look at the lady in front of them again. The woman turned back around and gave the group another emotionless stare. Now that Brock mentioned it, her face did look a lot like all the Nurse Joys they've met. Was she really the one who was missing, though? I am sorry. I do not understand what you are talking about, the woman muttered. I have always lived here at the castle with my master. I do not know a Nurse Joy. That's really weird. My instincts are never wrong when it comes to beautiful women. You look just like her, Brock said in confusion as he looked closer at her. Well, Brock does have that type of talent, Misty added thoughtfully with her finger to her chin. You must be mistaken. I am not a Nurse Joy, the woman replied robotically as she turned around to continue up the staircase. The group followed her once more, but couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something from them. Not to mention her behavior was extremely strange. Ash, Brock, Misty, and Serena were highly reminded of another individual who acted like this not too long ago. Hey guys. Doesn't this lady's behavior remind you a lot of how Sabrina was before she got her emotions back? Ash whispered to them. You're right, Serena replied quietly. She doesn't seem to have any emotions whatsoever. What are you guys talking about? Leaf mumbled from beside them. We faced a gym leader a while back named Sabrina of Saffron City. She had lost all of her emotions as a result of her psychic training. It wasn't until my haunter stepped in that she was able to regain her feelings, Ash explained. Oh yeah. I remember something like that, too, when I faced her, Gary whispered. You're telling me you were the one who saved her? He actually was, Misty replied. That sounds like something you would do, Ash. You just have that personality that always wants to help others, and it's part of what makes you a great Pokemon trainer, Leaf said with a smile. Heh. Not bad, Ashy boy, Gary added with a smirk. Heh. Thanks guys, Ash replied with embarrassment at the praise he was getting from his friends. Even if she isn't the missing Nurse Joy, I find it strange that she seems to be the only servant here at the castle. You would think there would be a lot here considering how big it is, Misty noted, getting the conversation back on track. Despite trying to keep their voices down, they were still loud enough for the woman to hear they were talking about her. She either didn't let it bother her or didn't care in general. As she continued up the staircase as if they weren't talking at all. After a long trek, the group finally made it to the top of the staircase. It ended to another set of large double doors, but not as big as the ones at the entrance. The woman opened the door and gestured the group to go inside. I will inform my master of your arrival. Please wait in here, the woman said as the group passed her. She then left the room and retreated to another set of stairs that went further up the castle. As the group took in the appearance of the room, they were glad that there were finally several lights on in this room. The well-lit room was a stark contrast to what the rest of the castle had been like so far. There was a table in the middle of the room with a basket of fruit on it and a small fountain off to the side. On the other side of the room was a helix that continued to spin upwards to parts unknown of the castle. It appeared to be a strange transporter of some kind. As they looked around more at the room, they realized they weren't alone in here. There was another single person in the room who was simply sitting at the table with a frown etched on his face. It didn't take the group too long to figure out that it was Paul. He apparently had managed to get across the ocean on his Firo and got here before the rest of them did. Deciding that there was nothing else to do at the moment, the group approached him while they waited. Upon seeing they were coming over, Paul rolled his eyes and let out a sigh. "So you actually managed to cross the ocean? That's really surprising," Paul muttered, speaking specifically to Ash. "Yeah. We crossed the ocean on Misty's Gyarados," Ash answered. There was no need for Paul to know they almost died a couple of times on the way over here. "Whatever," Paul muttered before turning away from the group. "Still the charmer as always, aren't you?" Misty scowled at him. "So you're this Paul I've heard about," Gary spoke up as he stepped in front of the others and glared at Paul. "Yeah. What of it?" Paul asked coldly as he turned back around and fixed Gary with a glare of his own. "Gary, it isn't a good idea to," Ash began but was shoved back by Gary. "I hear you train your Pokemon almost like a boot camp. You work them tirelessly and throw away any Pokemon who doesn't meet your standards. That's despicable," Gary accused angrily. "Great. I was hoping at least one of the trainers here would have some sense about training Pokemon the right way, but since you're friends with him, I should expect nothing less," Paul said with disdain. "That's terrible. Just who do you think you are treating Pokemon like that?" Gary shouted. "I should be asking you that. You're Gary Oak, aren't you?" Paul asked. Gary glared back. The way Paul had said his name didn't sound like a casual question. It sounded more like his voice was filled with disgust. Once more, it looked like strangers knew who he was just by looking at him. Such was the life of having a famous family. "Yes. That's me," Gary replied. "You think that just because you're the grandson of Professor Oak and son of the Kanto champion that it automatically makes you a good Pokemon trainer. The reality is you're probably a terrible trainer, and your own ego only makes you think you're good," Paul spat. "What's that supposed to mean?" Gary shouted. "It means that at least I earned my skills at battling rather than having to ride on the popularity of my family to get anywhere." "You're pathetic," Paul said spitefully. Gary gritted his teeth at Paul's words as he shrunk back. Those words really stung. He hated to say that, but there was some sort of truth to Paul's words. His old self was a very arrogant boy and always thought he was the best with nothing to back it up with. Now that he was actually a Pokemon trainer and out in the real world, he used to have a cheerleading squad that followed him around everywhere and only increased his arrogance. Then he was captured by Team Rocket and imprisoned at their base. That was when he realized that his thinking was wrong and wanted to really make a name for himself rather than live in the shadow of his relatives. He wasn't like his old self anymore. "Now just a second. Where do you get off?" Leaf demanded as she stepped in front of Gary. "I've only met you once before, but even I can tell you're nothing but a big jerk." Gary really is a great Pokemon trainer. You have no right to say those things to him. What would you know about battling? You aren't even a trainer. They're just a collection to you," Paul spat. "Excuse me? They are not. I love my Pokemon and treat them all equally. Getting to know a Pokemon and raising them is the best part of my journey. The same can't be said for you." Leaf fired back with disgust. Heh heh. If that's how you feel, how about a Pokemon battle? I'll prove it to you, Paul offered. Leaf was about to accept, but Gary put his hand out in front of her to stop her. No, Leaf. I'll battle him, Gary said firmly. Gary. Paul's not the best person to get into a confrontation with, Serena warned. It isn't about that, Gary asserted. I can't let him get away with insulting Leaf and me like this. He needs to be taught a lesson and fast. Even so, do you think that it would be a good idea to have a battle here of all places? We could get thrown out. Misty tried. I don't care. I'm going to prove to this guy that my Pokemon journey isn't just some big ego trip anymore. Gary replied hotly as he continued to glare daggers at Paul. He then withdrew a Pokeball and threw it forward. Nidoking, I choose you. Ash could do nothing but stand there and watch. He knew this wasn't such a good idea, but he had no room to tell Gary to ignore Paul. He himself had fallen for Paul's taunting more times than he could count. It would be rather hypocritical of him to tell Gary any different. He secretly was hoping Gary would beat Paul, though. Pika-Pie. Pikachu said, as if asking Ash why he wasn't stopping Gary. Sorry, buddy. It's just you know how I get when I'm around Paul. I have no right to tell Gary to stop, Ash murmured back. Heh, a Nidoking, huh? Paul smirked before putting on a serious expression and standing up from his chair. Magmar, stand by for battle. He then threw the Pokeball forward and released the Spitfire Pokemon. It gave loud cry and stood in front of Paul, ready to battle. Ash remembered his first battle with Paul and how he had a Magby at the time. It must have evolved since then. A Magmar? Nidoking and I can handle this. Right, Nidoking. Gary asked his Pokemon. Nidoking gave a roar in agreement. Well, your move, Paul said as he put his hands in his pockets. Fine then. Nidoking, horn attack. Gary yelled. Nidoking gave a roar and charged forward towards Magmar. It then lowered its head with the intention to stab it. Magmar and Paul did nothing, however. This is typical of Paul's strategy. He's letting Gary make the first move so he can test what kind of battler he is. Then he makes his move, Ash thought. He was about to warn Gary of Paul's intentions, but it was too late. Magmar, grab Nidoking's horn. Paul ordered. Just before Nidoking was about to attack Magmar, the Spitfire Pokemon reached out and clamped its hands around Nidoking's sharp horn, catching it and Gary completely off guard. Because only the tip of Nidoking's horn was lethal and contained poison, Magmar was unharmed. What? Gary cried. Fire punch, Paul said next. Magmar wound back a fist of fire before punching Nidoking square in the stomach. The drill Pokemon made a gasp of pain as it took several steps back from the burning jab, but it was made of tougher stuff than that. Swing your tail around and send Magmar flying. Gary shouted. Nidoking regained its senses and swung its large tail around much faster than one would expect. Before Magmar could react, it was knocked square in the midsection by Nidoking's tail and sent flying backwards before landing on the ground. Your Nidoking has good endurance. I'll give you that, at least, Paul murmured as Magmar got back up from the ground. You haven't seen anything yet. Gary cried. Nidoking, use earth power. Use flamethrower. Paul countered. The two attacks flew toward each other and collided in midair, creating an explosion. Once the smoke cleared, both Magmar and Nidoking were locked arm in a trial of will, trying to gain an advantage over the other. They appeared to be evenly matched. However, before the battle could go on any longer, the large double doors were opened once more, drawing everyone's attention back to it. The same servant woman from before entered again before turning to the group and giving them a stoic expression. "Stop the battle. My master will be very displeased if there is any battling before he arrives," she stated. Gary and Paul turned and gave a heated glare at each other. Despite having just met, they clearly had a strong dislike for each other. It may have rivaled even Ash and Paul's dislike for each other. There were so many words said in their looks to each other. This Pokemon battle was far from over and would definitely continue in the future. They finally broke eye contact with each other before calling off their Pokemon and heading over to the woman with the rest of the group. Magmar and Nidoking let go of each other before following their trainers. "My master has decided that everyone worthy of an audience with him has arrived. He will be here shortly," the woman said. "So we're not going to wait for any others to come?" Serena asked with confusion. "Only the trainers capable of braving the storm have proven themselves worthy in my master's eyes," the woman replied. The group exchanged glances upon hearing that. What was that supposed to mean? Was this planned all along? Did the world's greatest Pokemon master know that there would be a massive storm? The group was now positive something wasn't quite right. "Wait. You're saying that the storm was some kind of test?" Ash asked in confusion. "My master wants you to release all of your Pokemon from their Pokeballs and have a seat," the woman uttered, ignoring Ash's question. The group decided it best to obey. Even Paul didn't put up an argument. They took out their Pokeballs and released their Pokemon. Ash released Charizard, Bulbasaur, Wartortle, Pidgeotto, and Dratini. Serena released Charla, Jigglypuff, Nidorina, Scyther, Hitmonlee, and Eevee. Brock released his Onix, Graveler, Vulpix, Rhyhorn, Golbat, and Kabuto. Misty released Staryu, Starmie, Goldeen, Gyarados, Psyduck, and Shellder. Gary released his Arcanine, Blastoise, Kingler, Dodrio, and Golem. Leaf released her Venusaur, Dugong, Sandslash, Ninetales, Beedrill, and Venomoth. Finally, Paul let out his Electabuzz, Radon, Fearow, Tentacruel, and Exeggutor. "I can't help but wonder, why would your master ask us to release all of our Pokemon before he sees us?" Ash wondered. "Do not worry. My master's intentions will be clear soon enough," the woman answered. The group gave the stoic woman a wary glance before heading back over to the table and sitting down. Most of the water Pokemon went over to the fountain and got into the water where it was more relaxing, while the other Pokemon took to simply conversing with each other or standing by their trainers. As Ash sat down, Pikachu leaped onto his shoulder as expected, but he was surprised when Dratini hopped into his lap before curling up and going to sleep. "Oh. Haha. I guess you would rather stay with me, Dratini," Ash guessed. Dratini gave a soft coo in response as it continued to rest in Ash's lap. It wasn't up to meeting all of Ash's other Pokemon still and would rather stay by the boy who was going to show it the world. Though it had only recently been captured and been with Ash a short time, it had grown rather fond of him. "Ah, it's so cute," Leaf gushed as she placed her hands on her cheeks. The raven-haired boy gave a smile at the shy Pokemon, and he turned and noticed Paul glaring at him before turning away with a light grunt. That suddenly reminded Ash that Paul had caught a Dratini back in the Safari Zone, too. Only the one he caught was pretty mean-spirited. Perhaps it was best that Paul didn't have his Dratini here with him at the moment to avoid as much trouble as possible. Rather than sit down like the rest, Gary took to standing on the other side of the room as far away from Paul as possible. His back was turned, and he had his head down. It wasn't like him to be the one to avoid everyone like this, so all of his friends knew he must be very angry or upset right now. Gary had probably never had his pride hurt like that before. His Pokemon were around him trying to give him comfort, but to no avail. Ash could fully sympathize with Gary at the moment. Most of Paul's words were as sharp as a knife, and the worst part was, Paul actually believed everything he said with no remorse, and it looked like Gary believed it, too. Leaf was about to go over to talk to Gary, but Ash put up a hand to stop her. "Hold on, Leaf. Let me talk to Gary," Ash said gently. Leaf gave a small smile and slowly nodded her head in understanding before allowing Ash to go. Ash carefully picked up Dratini and stood up from his seat before making his way over to Gary with Pikachu following him. Gary gave a brief glance in Ash's direction when he saw him approaching but quickly turned away again. "Gary?" Ash started. Gary didn't reply at all. If it wasn't for the fact that Ash was right next to him when he said it, he wouldn't think Gary had heard him. "You really can't take what Paul says to heart." "I don't claim to know how Paul thinks because I don't, but I do know that he'll say whatever it takes to," Ash started. "Ash," Gary interrupted without looking at him, which caused Ash to be quiet. "What do you think of me as person? Tell me the truth. I've known you longer than anyone else here, so I need to know." Ash stared at Gary as he thought of how to reply. In the past, Ash would have immediately called Gary an arrogant jerk who only cared for himself. Now, he didn't think so anymore within the past year when Gary showed he could actually be human. Ash didn't have a famous family, so he didn't know what growing up in that type of lifestyle was like. Ash always wondered if he had an upbringing like Gary, if he would be just as cocky as he was. This Pokemon journey seemed to do a lot of good for Gary. Sure, he had a cheerleading squad with him at first, but not anymore. "Well," Ash began as appeared to get deep in thought. "I know you sometimes let your pride get the best of your words and actions." "I thought as much," Gary replied with a sigh. "Still," Ash continued, "I know you are a great Pokemon trainer who really cares for his Pokemon. You can be a really good friend and have good leadership when the time calls for it, too, and it shows. I don't think Serena and I could have made it through Silphco without some of your quick thinking." Gary finally turned around at Ash and gave him an incredulous look. Despite all of the years of teasing and bullying, Ash still thought of him as a good friend. He remembered. That's what Leaf was telling him back when they were in the Team Rocket prison cell. It wasn't that he didn't believe what she was telling him, and what she said really helped, it's just Gary had to hear this from Ash, too, for confirmation. They really did like him. "So you really think of me as my own person and a good friend, and not just part of a famous family?" Gary asked. "Of course. Don't listen to Paul. He doesn't even know you. He only believes his methods are right, and anyone who doesn't agree with him is pathetic," Ash told him. "Well, yeah," Gary agreed. "I've met Paul a few times in my travels so far, and everything he said to me, I've let it bother me, but I have to remember that what he thinks isn't true. I now get angry when I see him, not because of what he thinks of me like in the past, but because of how he treats and trains his Pokemon. Any Pokemon who doesn't have the best stats are worthless to him. Take Pikachu and Dratini here for example," Ash said as he gestured to the sleeping dragon type and the yellow rodent by his side. "I know for a fact that these Pokemon are strong because I've actually spent time with them. Pikachu has overcome incredible odds against Pokemon I don't think a normal Pikachu could beat. Dratini here may be shy, but it takes a lot of strength to try to overcome that, which is what it's doing. Paul fails to look at the hearts of Pokemon." Gary couldn't help but let out a smile at Ash's words. According to his friends who really mattered, he was Gary Oak the person, not just a part of his famous family. "Thanks a lot, Ash. That really means a lot to me," Gary said as he clapped his hand on Ash's shoulder. "No problem. What do you say we head back over to the others?" Ash suggested with a grin. "Sounds good, pal." Gary agreed. Serena and Leaf were watching the exchange between Ash and Gary with a smile on their faces. There never would have been such a talk between those two in the past, but they really seem to have grown since starting their journey. I don't think even those two realize how good of friends they are, Serena commented to Leaf. Yeah. Underneath all of the arguing and rivalry between them, they really do like each, Leaf added. Gary and Ash were just about to head over when their attention was drawn to the helix-like transporter that was at the far side of the room. A blue beam suddenly shot down in middle of it, snapping everybody else out their musings, as well. Here he is. My master is now arriving, the woman announced monotonously. The group began to squint their eyes to see if they could see any sign of a person coming through the transporter. This was it. The world's greatest Pokemon trainer was about to make his appearance. They couldn't help but feel a little anxious as the transporter glowed in front of them. They didn't know whether to feel excited or intimidated with what's happened so far since they got here. The exception was Paul, who merely had a look of curiosity on his face. A figure finally began to make its way quickly through the beam of the transporter, heading towards the ground. Ash, Misty, Brock, Serena, and Paul gave a strange glance at the being that was coming. Whatever was coming clearly didn't have the shape of a human. What was going on? What was that thing? Gary and Leaf, on the other hand, appeared to have a growing sense of dread on their faces. The outline of this figure was all too familiar to them. This couldn't possibly be the greatest Pokemon trainer that the woman was referring to, could it? Just please don't let it be that. They hadn't forgotten about what happened the last time they encountered this being, if that was the case. The being finally made it all the way down, and as soon as it touched the ground, the beam disappeared, letting the being's full features be shown. No, this definitely wasn't a human standing in front of them. It was Pokemon. The group immediately put on a look of pure confusion. They thought that the world's greatest Pokemon trainer was coming down the transporter. Was this just the Pokemon he was using? Granted, it was a Pokemon they had never seen before, but still. Ash turned to look at the others and noticed all of the color had drained from Leaf and Gary's faces. Last time they faced this thing, it had a bunch of armor on, so they were unable to identify it, but even though it wasn't wearing any this time, Gary and Leaf had that awful feeling. Return like last time. There was no mistaking it. It can't be, Gary stuttered. What's going on? Ash asked them. Ash, that's Mewtwo. Leaf exclaimed. The others immediately widened their eyes at that revelation as they turned back to the Pokemon in front of them. This was Mewtwo. This was the Pokemon that had been cloned from the legendary Pokemon, Mew. This was the Pokemon that had completely destroyed Leaf and Gary's Pokemon under the command of Giovanni. As if for confirmation, the woman said, "This is the world's greatest Pokemon trainer as well as the world's strongest Pokemon, Mewtwo." Mewtwo. Ash muttered in thought as he stared at the Pokemon in front of him. That's ridiculous. Paul suddenly said from beside everyone. He was the only one who didn't appear afraid right now. A Pokemon can't be a Pokemon master. Quiet, human. From now on, I make the rules, Mewtwo and the woman said at the exact same time. The group furrowed their brows at this. This explained the woman's strange behavior. She was under hypnosis and being controlled by Mewtwo this whole time. It talks? Gary asked in confusion. It must be because of its psychic abilities, Misty muttered. Paul, on the other hand, was gritting his teeth in anger. He wasn't used to being talked down to like that. So this Pokemon thought it was big and bad, did it? Well, he'll show it. Electabuzz. Stand by for battle and use Thunder Punch. He ordered. Wait. Don't. Ash cried at Paul, but it was too late. Electabuzz crackled with electricity as it ran forward and began to charge up its fist. It was about halfway there when Mewtwo's eyes glowed blue. Electabuzz was lifted off its feet and tossed to the back of the room like a toy. It then hit the wall and slumped the ground in pain. What? Paul exclaimed in confusion before he too was lifted off of his feet and thrown backwards. The group watched in surprise and horror as Paul was flung across the room and into the fountain. He emerged from the water a few seconds later and looked extremely angry. Ash went over to help, but Paul immediately shoved Ash out of the way and gave a death glare at Mewtwo in a rare display of emotion. "Everyone! Attack that Mewtwo!" he commanded. All of his Pokémon roared in anger at Mewtwo for harming their master. They all ran forward to attack it, but just like with Paul and Electabuzz before them, they were lifted off their feet and thrown backwards. As Paul saw this, his anger melted into uneasiness. He wasn't afraid, but he was far from comfortable. How could one Pokémon be able to take out his strongest Pokémon with little effort? "Child's play," Mewtwo muttered before addressing the woman in front of him. "Your usefulness has ended." Then with a wave of his hand, the woman blinked, and her glazed-over eyes seemed to return to normal. She began to moan in confusion before stumbling forward like she was going to faint. The parts of clothes covering her face came off in the process, revealing pink hair in two buns. She was the missing Nurse Joy, after all. "Nurse Joy!" Brock cried as he went over to catch her before she hit the floor. Where am I? How did I get here?" Nurse Joy wondered as she looked around in confusion. "You've been under my control recently. I transported you here from the Pokémon Center. Your knowledge of Pokémon physiology proved useful for my plan," Mewtwo answered. "I don't get it. What's going on? Is this some sort of scheme that you're doing for Team Rocket?" Ash exclaimed. "Team Rocket?" Mewtwo questioned thoughtfully. "So that is what that man called his group. He never told me their names, just that I was his slave. Wait. You aren't working with Team Rocket anymore? Then why are you doing this?" Serena asked. "Humans have done nothing but betray me since I was born. Because I am a clone, they treat me as an experiment rather than a living being. Humanity has turned its back on me, so I have turned my back on humanity," Mewtwo answered. "Not all humans are like Team Rocket," Ash exclaimed. "They're an evil criminal organization. You can't base all of us people over that one gang." "Silence, human!" Mewtwo yelled as his eyes glowed blue. Rather than being lifted off his feet, Ash suddenly felt his whole body begin stinging in great pain. Ash gasped and fell to the floor on his hands and knees. He was trembling all over as he tried to fight the pain in him. The only thing that had been able to counter any psychic abilities in the past was his aura, but it didn't look like it was activating right now. "Ash!" Serena cried as she and Leaf ran over to him. Ash continued to grimace in pain as Mewtwo continued to torture him. Tears began to fall from Serena's eyes as she looked up angrily at Mewtwo. She couldn't believe a Pokémon could be so cold-hearted like this. "Stop it!" she cried. "You're hurting him. Stop!" Mewtwo finally relented his psychic attack and stared disdainfully at Ash and Serena. "You're a fool," Mewtwo uttered to Ash. "All humans are despicable creatures, and your Pokémon are no better than you are for allowing you to enslave them." "Pika! Pika Pika Pikachu!" Pikachu said angrily at Mewtwo. "Cubone Bone Bone!" Cubone added with just as much intensity. "You're saying I'm wrong?" Mewtwo asked with a small bit of surprise in its normally monotone voice. "Pika Pie!" Pikachu yelled again. "You say that human isn't your master? He is your friend," Mewtwo echoed. He then addressed Cubone. "And you're saying that girl like a mother to you?" Both Pokémon nodded their heads in confirmation. Mewtwo's eyes narrowed at the two Pokémon. "You two are worse than any other. There is no way a Pokemon can be friends with a human, and they most certainly cannot act as a parent. Mewtwo then shot out a blast of psychic energy at the two. Ash and Serena ran as fast as they could and leaped at their Pokemon. They grabbed them and spun out of the way of the attack just in time. The blast of psychic energy continued to travel until it hit the wall in the back of the room, causing a small explosion. The group couldn't believe Mewtwo had actually tried to harm their Pokemon for just trying to reason with it. "Are you okay, buddy?" Ash asked Pikachu. Pikachu responded in the affirmative. "How about you, Cubone?" Serena asked. "Cubone," it answered, as well. "You are a disgrace, allowing humans to save you." "Humans and Pokemon can never be friends," Mewtwo said scornfully before adding. "This is a twisted world, so I am the new ruler of this world and everything in it. You're just a bully. You think that just because you have such strong powers that you can throw around any Pokemon or person you please." Misty shouted at it. "Do not lecture me on mistreating anything, girl," Mewtwo growled. "You have no idea what I have experienced with being mistreated. I was used as nothing but an experiment or slave the first part of my life. All of this was the fault of humans. You are all a dangerous species. You brought me into this world with no purpose but to be your slave. Your purpose wasn't just meant to be a slave, Mewtwo. You can do what you want." Ash shouted. "You're right. I now have my own purpose. My storm will create my own world, by destroying yours," Mewtwo said. "So this storm was caused by Mewtwo this whole time? I thought it was strange how even the weathermen were confused by this," Serena commented. "So you hate humans, and you're going to destroy all of us to save Pokemon?" Gary asked hotly. "No," Mewtwo replied with a shake of its head. "Your Pokemon will not be spared. As I said, they are all a disgrace for allowing themselves to be enslaved by you. If you're a Pokemon, there's no reason why I can't capture you." Paul shouted at Mewtwo. He then pointed his index finger forward. "Magmar. Use your flamethrower. Let's see how this thing does with attacks from a distance." The group turned in surprise at Paul. Was he insane? He actually believed he could try to capture Mewtwo. The Magmar took a deep breath before blowing the largest flamethrower it possibly could. The attack soared through the air towards Mewtwo, but the psychic Pokemon merely raised its hands and actually dissolved the attack in midair. Its eyes then glowed blue and sent Magmar flying into the wall once more. Paul couldn't believe this was happening. All of his Pokemon were being absolutely crushed by this thing with no effort. How could something this powerful even exist? "You're a fool," Mewtwo said to Paul this time. "Your Pokemon's attacks cannot harm me. My powers are too great. Nothing can defeat me." Ash gritted his teeth as he stared angrily at Mewtwo. It didn't matter if this Pokemon had a hard life so far. That gave it no right to treat humans and Pokemon this way. It had to be stopped. "I suppose you won't mind proving that in a real Pokemon battle then, would you?" Ash asked. "Is that a challenge?" Mewtwo questioned in a slightly amused tone. "You bet it is," Ash yelled. "My Pokemon and I have been through so many things together. We would never to lose you, right guys?" All of Ash's Pokemon cried out in agreement. The group looked on in wonder at Ash for attempting to stand up to Mewtwo while Paul watched Ash with frown on his face. This kid was either extremely brave or extremely stupid. He saw what happened to his own Pokemon just a second ago when he tried to attack Mewtwo. They didn't stand a chance. What made Ash think any different? Was it because of his corny training of his Pokemon through love and friendship? Yeah, right. Mewtwo's eyes glowed once more. It was then the group began to hear strange noises going on below them. They were very indistinguishable. Soon, the floor began to open up. As figures began to rise out from them, they were revealed to be 3 Pokémon coming from the holes, a Charizard, a Venusaur, and a Blastoise. They looked normal enough, but they had strange, dark markings all over their bodies. I started out with a Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, but for their evolved forms, I used their genetic material to create even more powerful copies, Mewtwo explained. What? These Pokémon are clones, too? Serena cried. All of this was getting too weird. The noise that were made by the copies was now replaced with a rumbling noise all around to their right. The group and their Pokémon looked around for the source until the wall on the right side began to rise slowly into the air. It didn't take long for the group to see there was another room beyond this door. Higher and higher the wall rose until the room on the other side was fully revealed. It's a stadium, Gary asked in confusion. Mewtwo must have planned this all along, Brock muttered in understanding. Mewtwo then levitated off of the ground and floated over to where the stadium was. His clone Pokémon doing the same. Getting the silent understanding to follow, the group made their way off to the side, also. Once they made it over, Mewtwo stood on one side while the group stood on the other. They were going to show Mewtwo just how wrong it was. Mewtwo eyed the humans in front of it with an amused expression. It knew for a fact that none of these Pokémon could stand up to its clones. Their abilities had been far enhanced beyond any normal Pokémon. Having a battle like this was completely unnecessary, but if that's what it took for these humans to understand their hopeless situation, then so be it. So which of you shall battle me first? Mewtwo asked. I will, Gary declared as he stepped forward with Blastoise. I'm going to use my first and strongest Pokémon against you. There's no way we're going to lose. Is that so? Well, I will even the playing field and use Blastoise, as well, Mewtwo responded as his cloned Blastoise stepped forward and let out a cry. We aren't going to lose to a fake. We've got this Blastoise, Gary encouraged. Blastoise. Blastoise agreed. You may make the first move, Mewtwo said. Gary narrowed his eyes at Mewtwo. This was just like before when he faced Mewtwo at the Viridian City Pokémon Gym. Giovanni had told Gary to make the first move, too. The same thing happened with Paul earlier. Though he technically wasn't facing Mewtwo itself now, Gary knew this was a trap. If Mewtwo was going to taunt him like this, Gary wasn't about to humor it. There had to be something else rather than just rush it. Maybe improve its defenses? Fine then. Blastoise. Improve your defense by using Iron Defense, Gary shouted. Blastoise gave a reply and appeared to be concentrating hard. After a few seconds, it began to glow for a second before stopping. When it was finished, it appeared to be a lot shiner to signal the attack was successful. How pathetic. Increasing your defense will not protect it against this Blastoise, Mewtwo muttered. The clone Blastoise gave a mighty cry before launching a hydro pump from the 2 cannons from its shell. Gary and Blastoise's eyes widened at the speed of the attack. Despite this, they figured they would be okay due to it not being a very effective attack. That was until the attack actually connected. Blastoise went flying backwards before landing on its shell where it didn't get back up. What? Gary cried as everyone else gasped. One of Gary's best Pokémon was knocked out after only one attack. Your Blastoise needs training, Mewtwo said with a slight smirk. Gary grit his teeth as he ran over to his fallen Blastoise. He couldn't believe something like this could have happened. How could his Blastoise have lost so easily? This didn't make any sense. It was his strongest Pokémon. Now who will battle me next? Mewtwo asked in a bored tone as the clone Venusaur stepped forward. I may have not had a formal invitation, but my Venusaur would like a taste of yours. Leaf stated as her fully evolved Bulbasaur stepped forward like Mewtwo's Pokemon did. Just because she wasn't aiming to be a trainer didn't mean she never battled with her Pokemon regularly. That is acceptable. We may now begin, Mewtwo uttered. Venusaur. Use Vine Whip. Leaf yelled. If she was unable to attack it directly, she could try something indirect like this by using its vines. The clone Venusaur responded by unleashing its own Vine Whip. Several vines from both sides clashed together as they tried to compete for dominance. After a few seconds, the clone Venusaur's Vine Whips found an opening and knocked Leaf's Venusaur's vines away. It then reached out and grabbed her Venusaur with its vines before hurling it across the stadium. Venusaur landed with a thud and didn't get back up. Venusaur! Leaf cried as she ran over to it. The remaining group continued to stare flabbergasted at the strength of Mewtwo's Pokemon. How could they knock out their Pokemon with just one attack? Even Paul couldn't help but be surprised at this. Now which of your Charizards shall battle me? Mewtwo asked, referring to Charla and Charizard. The two Charizard looked at each other as if deciding who should go. They both wanted to battle and both wanted to prove Mewtwo wrong. I have a better idea. Both of your Charizard should battle mine. That shall certainly prove my extra powerful clone Pokemon's abilities more than your pathetic, weak ones. Mewtwo suggested. Both Charizard felt fire in their eyes at that comment. They were not weak by any means. They were not going to be mocked like that. If this Mewtwo thought that, they were going to prove it wrong. The both stepped forward onto the stadium floor and nodded to each other. They were going to take out this clone Charizard together. There was nothing they couldn't do when they were a team. Ash and Serena stood worriedly as they watched their Charizard. They knew they were powerful Pokemon but also saw how easily Paul, Gary, and Leaf's Pokemon were defeated. They hoped that two Pokemon would be enough to win against a clone. At least that will undermine Mewtwo's power a little bit, which will help. We may now begin, Mewtwo stated as the clone Charizard stepped forth. Charizard and Charla gave a mighty roar before taking flight and going straight towards the clone Charizard. It responded by taking flight as well and going towards the open sky. The other two Charizard followed it. Once they were in the air, they began trading blows back and forth. Despite Charla and Charizard's best efforts to keep it busy by attacking from opposite sides, they couldn't find an opening. The clone Charizard would always be able to block with some type of parry. Charla finally decided to try something different and flew at the clone in a zigzag pattern to make its movements more unpredictable. The clone Charizard's eyes widened at this, as it tried to keep up with Charla's movements and hold off Ash's Charizard at the same time. When it finally got close enough, Charla swung its fiery tail around and slapped the clone right in the face. It had scored a hit. Unfortunately, the clone Charizard recovered quickly and grabbed Charla's tail before it could spin out of the way. It then swung Charla around like a baseball bat and struck Charizard with Charla, knocking it backwards and stunning it. It then hurled Charla to the ground as hard as it could before flying over to Ash's Charizard and slapping it with its tail, which it sent it to the ground, too. The clone Charizard then breathed in and unleashed the largest flamethrower anyone in the group had ever seen. Charla and Charizard were engulfed by the massive flames as they fell. When the attack ended, both Pokemon were lying on the ground next to each other, defeated. Ash and Serena let out a gasp as they ran to their fallen Pokemon like the others before them. This was unreal. Not even two of their Pokemon teaming up was enough to take out clone Pokemon. How was this possible? How were they that powerful? You are fools, Mewtwo said. Your pathetic Pokemon were no match for mine. I had their special abilities greatly enhanced when I made them. You were doomed from the start. The group glared at Mewtwo. So that's what it was. It made sense. All of their Pokemon had been defeated by some type of special attack. And now, Mewtwo began as it lifted its hands into the air. As victor of the Pokemon match, I shall now claim my prize. Your Pokemon. Several objects appeared from seemingly nowhere and flew towards the group and their Pokemon. They looked like Pokeballs, but also different. They were completely black in color and much bigger than the average one. Before they even knew what hit them, Charla, Charizard, Venusaur, and Blastoise were sucked in by one of the Pokeballs. The objects then flew off into a part of the building unseen. What's happening? Serena cried as they watched. He's trying to take our Pokemon. Ash yelled as a couple more were captured. It was then the group registered the severity of situation. They sprang into action and began to collect as much of their Pokemon as they could from the incoming black Pokeballs. Some Pokemon began to attack the Pokeballs themselves only to be captured as soon as another ball made contact with them. Ash yelled out when he saw Pidgeotto attempting to fly away. Unfortunately, the balls were faster than it was. It was inside one of them in seconds. Serena turned and saw Hitmonlee, Jigglypuff, and Scyther forming a circle around Nidorina, Eevee, and Cubone. They were trying to fend off as many Pokeballs as they could and were being quite successful. However, it was clear they were tiring out. Serena looked on with horror as she saw 3 black Pokeballs coming for them from above, out of their line of sight. "Look out!" she cried, but it was too late. The Pokeball sneaked up on Hitmonlee, Jigglypuff, and Scyther, and sucked in the 3 Pokemon. Upon seeing this, Nidorina, Eevee, and Cubone made a run to Serena. The honey blonde girl left Ash's side and ran to them, as well. If she could just reach them, she might be able to protect them. However, that wasn't the case. Serena cried out when 2 Pokeballs came out of nowhere and captured Nidorina and Eevee, effectively sucking them inside and carrying them off. Her eyes widened when she saw another Pokeball coming towards Cubone. She made a dive for Cubone and grabbed it just before the Pokeball did. She immediately scooped the lonely Pokemon in her arms as it threw a boomerang at the incoming black Pokeball, disabling it momentarily. Serena smiled at Cubone before hugging it tight and running to go find Ash. Paul was attempting to fight off the Pokeballs himself as he used his fists, kicked them, hit them with his backpack, anything to keep them away. His Pokemon were attacking them, too. Their efforts were futile as the Pokeballs soon found their way around Paul and captured his Pokemon. Paul gave out a cry of rage as he saw his Pokemon were captured, too, but could do nothing but watch them be carried off. Vulpix, no! Brock cried as the fox Pokemon was taken from his arms. He then turned and saw Graveler and Onix captured, too. He then turned to Misty. "I say we don't try to fight the Pokeballs anymore and just make a run for it." "Good idea." Misty agreed as she called over Storie, Starmie, and Psyduck. Gyarados, Goldeen, and Shellder had already been captured. The 3 Pokemon then hurried over to their trainer while more black Pokeballs chased them. Psyduck was soon smacked in the backside due to being slower. Sigh. Psyduck wailed as it frantically waved its arms back and forth as the Pokeball sucked it inside of it. The remaining Pokeballs then surrounded Storie and Starmie before capturing them, as well. They then sneaked behind Brock's remaining Pokemon and captured them, too. Brock and Misty could do nothing but look on in distress as all of their Pokemon were captured. They didn't even have clue where the Pokeballs were going. "It is futile to resist," Mewtwo uttered amongst the chaos. Ash's Wartortle and Bulbasaur were putting up a good fight against the Pokeballs. They were backed into a corner of the room using whatever attacks they could to fend off the black Pokeballs. Since they were in a corner, the Pokeballs couldn't sneak up on them from behind like they had with the others. Ash, with Dratini still in his arms and Pikachu by his side, ran up to the two and began to help them fight the Pokeballs before a thought came to him. There was no way the Pokeballs could capture them if they were already inside their Pokeballs. "I've got it. You'll be safe inside your Pokeballs," Ash realized as he pulled them out. The two Pokemon turned and nodded their heads while Ash returned them to their Pokeballs. He then turned to Dratini. "All right, Dratini. In you go. You'll be safe in there," Ash told it as he fished out Dratini's Pokeball. Dratini nodded its head but soon cried out in alarm as it saw one coming directly behind Ash. The raven-haired boy turned and ducked just in time as the Pokeball soared over him. He then shielded Dratini from the incoming black Pokeballs until something unexpected happened. They went over to Wartortle and Bulbasaur's Pokeballs before actually capturing the Pokeballs. "What?" Ash shouted as he watched with a baffled expression as his Pokeballs were sucked into the black ones before being carried off. How was that possible? That moment's distraction was all that was needed for another Pokeball to sneak up on Ash and strike Dratini. The dragon Pokemon's eyes widened as it turned to Ash with a pleading expression as the Pokeball opened up to take it. Ash immediately made a grab for Dratini as he saw the Pokemon leave his grasp. However, all his hands met were air. Dratini's eyes watered before the Pokeball completely sucked it in, too. Ash watched with despair as it left with Wartortle and Bulbasaur to parts unknown in the castle. By that time, Serena had reached him. She was panting and out of breath from all the running she had done. Cubone was still in her arms. "Serena!" Ash yelled as he went over to her. "They have all my Pokemon except Cubone, Ash." Serena cried as tears ran down her face. "I know. They capture all of mine except Pikachu," Ash said before turning to glance at the rodent, only to find it wasn't there. "Pikachu!" Ash called as he frantically looked around. His eyes widened as he saw the yellow rodent running away from a horde of Pokeballs that were chasing it. Before long, it had been backed against the spiral transporter and was trapped. Without thinking, Ash tore after Pikachu as fast as he could. It must have run off when it saw the Pokeballs coming that Ash didn't see in all the confusion. Ash couldn't believe he let something like this get by him after all he and Pikachu had been through. Serena ran after Ash, but stopped when almost 10 black Pokeballs appeared in front of her. They began to circle Serena before swooping in to take Cubone. She threw her arms around a young Pokemon in her best efforts to shield it from the dark Pokeballs. She knew she couldn't block them forever, though. Maybe Cubone would be safe inside of her backpack. Serena quickly unzipped her backpack before placing Cubone inside. "You'll be safe in here," she told it. Cubone nodded as she closed the opening. Serena looked up to see 5 black Pokeballs hovering next to her. They all zoomed towards the backpack and continually bounced off of the material. Serena thought she might have protected it, but that was until another black Pokeball and came and sliced a small slit in her backpack before going inside. How could they do that? No. Serena screamed as she unzipped her backpack again as fast as she could to get the trapped Pokemon. She opened it just as the Pokeball connected with Cubone. She watched with utter devastation as Cubone looked up at her with the teary eyes before disappearing inside of the black Pokeball. It then flew out of Serena's backpack before flying off with the rest. Serena reached out and grabbed onto the black Pokeball and attempted to pull back, but the black Pokeball's tug was stronger. It was yanked out of her hands before flying off. Tears began to fall as Serena watched the dark Pokeball get further and further away. She couldn't believe it. She had failed to protect even Cubone. As Serena turned to look around the room, she saw all of her friends and Paul grimacing in despair. She then realized all of their Pokemon had already been captured. The only one left was Pikachu. Ash managed to reach Pikachu and shielded him from the Pokeballs. They all bounced off the raven-haired boy as he gritted his teeth from the onslaught. They hurt a lot more. Then they looked when striking him. Pikachu stopped attacking and looked at Ash with wonder. Just run, Pikachu. I'll be fine. Ash told it while panting. Pikachu reluctantly turned away from Ash and began to make its way off of the spiral transporter while more Pokeballs began to chase after it. Unbeknownst to Ash and Pikachu, the rest of the group was silently cheering for it as it ran away and managed to shock the balls away from it each time. If it was able to escape the Pokeballs, maybe they could find a way to release their other Pokemon. Pikachu's endurance had other plans, however. Pikachu had made all the up the spiral transporter in the room and was getting pretty tired from the constant running and thunderbolts it did. Pikachu looked down and saw Ash had recovered from the Pokeballs and had begun to run up the spiral staircase, also. Pika-Pie! Pikachu cried at Ash. I'm coming, Pikachu. Don't worry. Ash shouted as he ran. Pikachu once more thunder-shocked at black Pokeball that had come to take it. It hoped Ash could reach it soon. It couldn't hold up much longer. Pikachu's eyes then widened. Horror as it saw at least 20 Pokeballs coming for it. There was no way it could get rid of all of them with how tired it was. Ash must have realized this, too, because he began to pick up his pace. He was almost there, but the Pokeballs were faster. Not knowing what else to do, Pikachu leaped off of the platform and dived to the ground just before Ash reached it. Everyone gasped in surprise when they saw Ash actually dive off the transporter after Pikachu. Ash began to force himself downward in order to get to Pikachu faster. He was just about to reach it when a black Pokeball soared past him, before striking Pikachu in midair. No. Pikachu! Ash cried as the rodent went inside. The Pokeballs had captured everyone's Pokemon. Ash glared as the Pokeball began to fly away. He wasn't going to let it get away with Pikachu that easily. He reached out and grabbed the Pokeball as it went to pass him. To his great surprise, the Pokeball began to pull him along, as well. As Ash was being carried off, he began to try to pry the Pokeball open with his bare hands, but to no avail. He then looked to see where he was going and saw an opening in the floor. His eyes narrowed. If they were taking Pikachu, they were taking him, too. Ash! Serena screamed as she chased him down the room. Wait, Serena! Leaf called out as she and Gary tried to reach out and grab her and missed. Ash braced himself as the narrow opening drew nearer. He didn't care what happened to him as long as they didn't take Pikachu. He repositioned his body so he would be able to fit in the opening. Within the seconds, the Pokeballs went through, taking Ash with them. Serena gasped as she saw the opening began to close. She had to make it. She wasn't going to let Ash go in there alone. She had to save her Pokemon, too. Serena made a dive and slid into the opening just before it shut completely. Both she and Ash were now gone. The rest of the group had their mouths open in horror at what had just transpired. Their Pokemon had just been stolen by Mewtwo, and they had been powerless to save them. To top it off, both Serena and Ash were now missing. Who knows where that opening would lead them? Would it lead them straight into a death trap? They turned back to look at Mewtwo and saw it had a smirk of satisfaction on its face as it leered at the humans before it. They could only imagine what Mewtwo had in store for them now. High above them, hiding behind a pillar, Mew watched the scene with interest. That raven-haired boy and honey blonde-haired girl were pretty interesting. They made to go after their Pokemon in the face of danger. If it recalled correctly, it could have sworn Articuno mentioned 2 humans it met who fit that description who had great potential in saving the world. Could that be them? Deciding to investigate matters for itself, Mew turned around and flew off to another part of the castle where the trapdoor lead. Maybe it should meet with this boy and girl and find out what they are all about.